My dad used to take me and my brother camping when we were kids. He always told us it was character building, and we would learn a lot about ourselves out there. We never used to go to any official campsites or anything like that. He would always take us deep into the wilderness, where there was no cell reception and miles away from anywhere. My dad was quite the survivalist. You could airdrop him from a plane in an unknown territory and he could find his way home. We always set off early in the morning so we would have time to get to the destination and pitch our tents and build a fire. The last time we camped, my dad parked the car down some dirt road and we set off walking into the forest. About 30 minutes into our journey, we saw what I can only describe as a small shed. It looked derelict, and no one had entered it for years. Far too small to be a home for anyone, and it didn't make any sense for it to be all the way out here. As we walked past, I tried to look through the window, but it was too dirty to see anything inside. I could see it was locked from the outside by a padlock, which looked a whole lot newer than the shed. We continued to walk for another 20 minutes and finally set up camp. We built a fire and got everything set up for the next day so we could set off early in the morning. Dad said he had something special for us, but wouldn't tell me or my brother what it was. Later into the evening, as the night started to settle in, it started to rain, and I don't mean drizzle. I mean it started to pour down torrential rain. We all went into our tents to stay dry and would talk on the walkie-talkies. About an hour later, we heard 2 gunshots that didn't sound that far away. My dad told me and my brother to stay put, and he would go and check what it was. My brother and I waited for my dad to return, but after about 45 minutes, we were starting to worry. We tried to call him on the walkie-talkie, but there was no answer. After another 30 minutes, me and my brother decided we were going to look for our dad when we heard someone trudging through the mud outside our tent. We then heard 2 more gunshots in the distance, and whoever was outside our tent ran off into the distance. We gathered anything we might need, like hunting knives and a flare gun that we had for emergencies. Dad told us if anything were to ever happen, to always make sure we took the flare gun. The rain continued to pour, and we set off walking to find our dad. My dad had taught us some tricks about tracking, which we tried to use, but after about 2 hours, it felt like we were just walking round in circles. It didn't help that the rain was turning everything into a boggy swamp. That's when I saw a small light coming from the distance. As we got closer, we realized it was the shed we had seen earlier that day. There seemed to be some small lantern or candle shining through the dirt in the window. We tried to call my dad on the walkie-talkie and heard the static sound coming from the shed. The downpour of the rain drowned out the sound of us trying to creep through the bushes and towards the shed. As I was the oldest of me and my brother, I said I would go and check for any signs of our dad. As I got closer, I saw that the door, which was earlier padlocked, was now open. I found our dad tied up and laying on the floor unconscious. He had a small laceration to his head that was bleeding quite profusely. I called my brother, and he helped me to wake him and get him to his feet. We left everything at the camp and made our way back to the car. Thankfully, although my dad was concussed, he was able to lead us back the way we came. He later told us that he found a man sitting on some rocks holding a gun, and he called over to him to make himself known. The man started laughing, and next thing he knew, he woke up on the floor in the shed. He said someone must have hit him from behind, and it knocked him out cold. We drove home that night, and my dad came back a few days later with a few of his hunting buddies, but they were unable to find anything. All our tents and things we left behind had been packed up and taken. Every now and again, my dad goes out on a drive for a couple of days with his buddies. I'm certain they go back, looking for whoever knocked him out and tied him up. My dad's just too proud to let it go. I was a pretty typical teenager. My life revolved around makeup, clothes, and boys. Not that I had a boyfriend, nor did I have the money for makeup or the latest fashions. Nagging Mom for cool clothes never worked. She never liked the stuff I wanted and insisted on buying me things she called classic, styles that would never go out of fashion. Yawn. So I decided that I needed a part-time job. Then I'd have my own money. I could buy what I wanted.
and surely I'd then look grown up and sophisticated, and a boyfriend would soon follow. Well, that was the plan anyway. Living in a village, the employment options for a teenager were pretty limited. I was too young to work in the local bar, and there was only one shop, and they weren't hiring. Then I got lucky. My aunt lived in the next village, and she worked in a care home there. They needed someone for a few weeks to cover while someone was away. I'd be staying overnight to help out in case there was an emergency. Aunt Mary told me that there was never really any sort of emergency, but the rules stated they needed that extra pair of hands available at all times. I'd just go and sleep there, and if I was needed, they would wake me up. Well, that sounded perfect. I'd get paid for sleeping. I was so excited to be earning my own money, I couldn't wait to start. The job worked out perfectly. Mom would drop me off after school to spend the night there. I'd make the staff coffee and get to sleep. Before I knew it, the alarm was going off, and I was up and off to catch the early morning bus back home to get ready for school. The bus home was always deserted, a rural route between two villages at the crack of dawn. I'd put my headphones on and daydream about spending my wages. Then, on the second day, I felt as if I'd been fated to get this job, as I saw the most gorgeous boy in the woods as we drove by. He was camping out. I only noticed him as I saw the glow of his cigarette. This was definitely a boy my parents wouldn't approve of, but OMG was he good looking. His little campsite was so well hidden, it was a miracle I spotted him, but once I knew he was there, I looked out for him every day. I couldn't get this boy out of my mind. The next day when I passed him, I'm sure our eyes locked together. I felt like it was love at first sight. He had the most beautiful eyes, deep and dark, so romantic. I imagined camping out with him, holding his hand as the sun set. The next day I felt brave. I was working now. I was practically a grown-up, so I needed to get confident and make things happen. I gave him a wave and a smile. He waved back. It was then I just knew we were destined to be together. I wondered how old he was. I guessed he was older than me, but that didn't matter. I just knew we'd be happy together. We had a connection. From that day on, we would wave to each other. And then he started blowing me kisses. I just knew he felt the same way. He was going to be my boyfriend, I was sure, and I just knew my friends would be jealous of the romantic story of how we met. I'd never felt happier. He filled all my thoughts night and day. I counted down the hours until I could see him again. But how were we ever going to meet? I didn't really know how to get to those woods. We had to meet. It was our destiny. But of course, true love always finds a way, and my prayers were answered when one day he was holding up a sign. It read, "Meet me at Den Hill at midnight." I knew where Den Hill was. We used to go there when I was a kid. There were caves there we would play in, pretending we were brave adventurers. I knew Mom and Dad would never let me go there on my own after dark, but that wasn't going to stop me. I'd been given my own house key since I was now getting in before anyone else was up. So I made a plan. I'd pretend to go to bed, but I'd keep my clothes on and just hide under the covers. Then I'd sneak out and go and meet my handsome stranger. That evening time passed so slowly. I was so excited but didn't want to show it in case anyone got suspicious. So many thoughts were going through my head. What was his name? Where did he live? Would he kiss me? We ate dinner, which seemed to take forever, and we all went to watch TV. Dad's boring and just has to watch the news every night. But this night I didn't even complain. I just patiently sat and waited, with excitement brewing secretly in my tummy. But then, my world fell apart in an instant. There, on the TV screen, on the local news program, was a picture of a young man. My young man. I nearly fainted. Why was he on the news? As the story unfolded, I felt sick to my stomach. The reporter told of the capture of a wanted criminal, a man who had lured young girls to remote parts of the countryside and horribly assaulted them. "I hope they throw away the key," said my mom. I couldn't say anything. I made an excuse saying I was feeling unwell, and I went to my room. I sobbed my heart out, for the love I'd lost that had never been, and for what could have happened later that night. The what-ifs of these events haunt me to this day.
Back in October, I started dating this great guy named Vinny. He was sweet and loving, and we hit it off instantly. He was handsome and very rich. He constantly spoiled me with all kinds of expensive presents, jewelry, clothes, a new car. The only problem was that he was always working. I assumed that all of the lavish presents were his way of apologizing for all the time he spent in the office. It was a bit frustrating because I really wanted to see him, but I understood that he was under a lot of pressure. A few months ago, he invited me to this really nice restaurant for dinner. I got us a table, but Vinny canceled on me at the last minute. I had already gotten a table, so I decided to just eat dinner by myself. Right after my food arrived, I noticed that there was a man sitting at a table across from me. He was blonde and handsome, and the only other person eating alone. I caught him staring at me a couple times, but I didn't think anything of it. I figured he'd wanted to come over and ask me out, but he didn't have the nerve. After I finished my food, I paid the bill and left. As I was leaving the restaurant, I noticed that the blonde man was leaving too. He was walking fast, as if he wanted to catch up to me. I got a bad feeling about him and hurried to my car before he could reach me. As I drove away, I saw him standing in the middle of the parking lot, staring at me. He wrote something down on a piece of paper. I didn't realize until later that he was writing my license plate number. After that, I started noticing the blonde man more and more. I saw him in the park while I was jogging. I saw him hanging outside the theater after Vinny took me to see a movie. I even saw him waiting outside my office when I had to go into work after hours. Each time, he just stared at me with this cold expression. The worst part was that Vinny never seemed to catch a glimpse of him. I tried to tell him that someone was following me, but whenever he looked, the man was gone. I was starting to get really freaked out. Then, one night, I was home alone when Vinny ran into the house in a panic. I tried to ask him what had happened, but he said he didn't have time to explain. He told me that we were in danger. We needed to leave right away. In my heart, I knew that the man had come back. My car was parked on the street behind us, and we had to race through our dark backyard to get to it. We had a lot of trees back there, plenty of places for someone to hide. Vinny looked all around, as if he was expecting someone to jump out. We got to the car, and there was a rustle from the trees behind us. Someone was hiding there. Vinny told me to get into the car. He pulled a gun out of his pocket. I had no idea he even owned a gun. Before I could say anything, he was gone, charging into the trees. I tried to open the car door and realized with horror that Vinny still had the keys. I was alone out there. I tried to see Vinny, but it was too dark. I waited. Then I heard two voices, Vinny's and another man's. It had to be my stalker. They were shouting at each other, but I couldn't make out the words. I heard a struggle, and then a single gunshot. I waited, my heart racing, and then slowly, that blonde man walked out of the trees. I screamed and started to run away. "Wait!" he called after me. I kept going, and he raced after me. Soon, he caught up and grabbed me from behind. I fell to the ground, and that man held me in place. I knew he was going to kill me, just like he'd killed my boyfriend. I screamed for help. And he said, "Please, let me explain." His voice was calm and sympathetic, so I stopped screaming. He explained that he was with the FBI, and he'd been trailing my boyfriend for months. Vinny was a hitman for one of the most dangerous crime families in the country. He'd finally realized that the FBI was on his tail, so he was trying to flee with me as a hostage. If this man hadn't stopped him, I would have been kidnapped by my own boyfriend. I'm in witness protection now, trying to restart my life. It's been tough, but at least I'm safe, and it's all thanks to the man I thought was my stalker. My cousin and her husband got married during the height of the pandemic. It's something they'd been planning for years, and when we went into lockdown, they decided to go ahead and officially tie the knot and just have their celebrations later. 2 years later, they had their second wedding day, and all their friends and family attended. The venue was about a 4-hour drive from where we lived, and was practically in the middle of nowhere. I'm talking so far into nowhere that you could see all the stars in the sky like fireflies on a black canvas. I'm from the city, so light pollution was always something I had to contend with. Even on a clear day, you can't really see the stars. Not much, anyway. The day after their second wedding, a few of us had stayed for an extra night to catch up with family and go for a meal. We went to a local bar, and as I'm not much of a drinker, I offered to drive everyone back to their accommodation. My cousins and their parents were 10 minutes up the road, so I offered to take them first, as we were about a 20-minute drive away. I drove up this small, dark country road with hedges on both sides. This empty road eventually led to a small dirt path and took us to the lodges where they were all staying. We said our goodbyes, and I made my way back to get my family. On the drive back down the country lane, I saw a frog hopping across the road in front of me. I don't like to kill any living creatures, so I stopped the car and got out, leaving my door wide open. This frog just sat there in the middle of the road as if playing dead. I jumped, stomped, and clapped, trying to scare this frog out of the road. After a couple of minutes, the frog leaped off and went into the bushes. I walk back towards my car when I see a man coming right at me. I soon realized it was my own reflection in the car door window. I kinda laughed and shrugged it off, but this made me realize how vulnerable and out in the open I was. I hadn't even noticed my surroundings because of the headlights shining on me. The reality of it was, I was in the middle of nowhere, on an empty road, in the black of night. I mean, I've seen horror movies that start out this way. I jumped back into the car and locked the doors, took a deep breath and set off driving. In my own twisted little way, I realized that if this was some kind of horror movie, the killer's probably hiding in the back seat. I started to speed up as I was subdued to my own anxiety. I put my hand over my throat, thinking if someone was in the back and tried to strangle me or cut my throat, that my hand would in some way protect me. I knew it was all probably in my head, but I didn't want to put my hand in the back to find out the hard way that it wasn't my imagination. I drove as fast as I could back to the bar and parked up next to some woman having a smoke and ran in to see my family. I shared my story, and they laughed at how ridiculous it was, and it was just me being paranoid.
Why wouldn't you just check? You watch too many videos on YouTube,
they said. We collected our belongings and made our way back to the car just outside. As we were getting into the car, the smoking woman called out, "Excuse me, your friend's just gone over there into the trees." "What friend?" I asked. "The one who was in the back of your car," she replied. We all looked at each other in awe. We quickly checked the car, got in, and drove away. I don't think this person was out to hurt me, probably just after a free ride somewhere, but who knows what they might have done if I had kept driving on my own. I used to work night shifts as a receptionist at a roadside motel. I enjoyed working the night shift, as after about 10 p.m., you could just put the television on and relax. Every now and again, you would get someone wanting a room last minute. This could be someone who's been on the road all day and looking for somewhere to crash, or someone that's about to commit adultery and looking for a cheap place to bring their mistress. It isn't really any of my business what people do here, as long as it's consensual. This one night started out just like any other. I'd completed all my check-ins, ordered takeout, and sat down behind the desk watching some late-night TV. I would lock the door to the reception at about 10 p.m., and if anyone wanted to check in, I would just let them in. I can't remember exactly what I was watching, but it got to about 1 a.m. when I saw a man at the window staring at me. It made me jump, but I just assumed it was a customer looking for a bed for the night. He didn't look overly homeless, and I was thinking maybe he was just lost or that he wanted a room for the night. I stood up and walked to the window and tried to talk to him. "Hi, would you like a room for the night?" He stood there staring through the window, but what made this weirder was that he didn't even react to me being there and talking to him. He was just staring in through the window. I tried to talk to him again, but nothing. Not a word. He just stood there staring through the window. I looked away for a second as the noise from the TV caught my attention. When I looked back, the man had turned and was staring right at me. He startled me so much I let out a scream. The man then grabbed the door handle and started pulling on it aggressively. Then he started kicking it as if he was trying to break in. I ran back to the desk to call the police, but before I could dial, the door gave way and the man came inside. I screamed and ran into the bathroom and locked the door, expecting the man to come and find me, but he never came. I had left my cell phone on the desk, so I couldn't even call for help. I could hear the man ransacking the office and turning it upside down. Eventually, it went quiet. I came out of the bathroom slowly. The office was turned upside down. I called the owner and the police, and both came out to the motel. I had noticed that the man had taken the master keys from the key cabinet. Concerned for the people within the motel, the 2 officers searched every room, but never found the man. I was fired for leaving the key cabinet open, as the owner then had to change all the locks, which he didn't like. A few years ago, Sheila, who was a close friend of mine, was down on her luck. She had recently lost both her husband and her job. She was in a state of depression, but this woman was like a diamond in the rough, and no matter how bad things were, she always put on a brave face for her 2 children and never let them see her pain. We were talking one day last fall, and with Christmas slowly approaching, Sheila burst out into tears because she didn't think she would be able to make Christmas happen this particular year. I was staying with her and tried to keep her as positive as I could to help and let her know she wasn't alone. I suggested she sell a few items that she didn't use anymore. It would be a great way to have a declutter and make some money in the process. Sheila reluctantly agreed, and I told her I would help her upload them to Craigslist, among other seller websites, and see if we could make Christmas special this year. Sheila has 2 beautiful children, and I know she didn't want to disappoint them, and being a good mother, agreed to sell off some of her and her late husband's possessions. She took photos of everything from garden furniture to DIY tools to fishing gear, and in particular, a really nice solid oak table she had in the main living area. She received several calls, and people came to view the listed items. Many were sold, and Sheila was feeling a lot more positive about the whole Christmas situation, and I saw something in her that I hadn't seen in a while. She had a sparkle of life in her, that she knew everything was going to be okay. After about a week, Sheila received a call about the table we had listed. It was listed for $1,000, so there hadn't been much interest in it overall. A man who introduced himself as Derek called and asked if the table was still available, and said he would pay the asking price, no questions asked, if she would reserve it for him. He said he worked late, so it would likely be after dark when he came. Now Sheila was in a bad place at the time, and the sale of this table made all the difference to the kind of Christmas they were going to have, so she agreed that he could come to collect the table any time, and just to call in advance. I wasn't with Sheila on the night the call came in, but Derek called and said he was on his way, and would likely be there just after 9 p.m. When Derek arrived, he didn't pull his pickup into the drive, but instead parked it at the bottom of the drive, which was strange in itself, but Sheila didn't think anything of it at the time. He walked up the path and knocked on the door to be met by Sheila and asked if he could step inside to see the table. Sheila noticed 2 men standing by the gate at the bottom of the drive. "Are they with you?" Sheila asked. Yeah, they're here to help me move the table. I'll call them in once I've seen it." Sheila told me that she felt safer this way than just allowing 3 men into her home, but was still weary of the situation. Now, when talking to Derek on the phone, Derek was adamant that he wanted the table. He was so sure, and Sheila had even said to me that she thought that maybe she was missing something, and the table was worth a whole lot more than what she was selling it for, but she was willing to let that go for a Christmas her children deserved. Derek spent a lot of time looking at the table, checking for scratches, damage, and just asking lots and lots of unrelated questions. As they were mid-conversation, Derek's phone vibrated. He looked at his phone and said he would need to speak to his wife first, as it was for her, as a gift, and said he needed to go. Sheila offered to knock $200 off the price, but Derek had just lost complete interest. She showed him to the door and noticed his two friends were nowhere to be seen. He walked down the drive and got in the passenger side door, and the pickup drove off. I remember Sheila telling me that something in her gut just didn't feel right. Something was wrong. Sheila checked the kids' room, and both were sleeping in bed. Nothing appeared to be out of the ordinary, and that's when she realized Bruno, the family dog, was nowhere to be found. Sheila called me, and I came straight home and we searched for him everywhere. We searched the house, the garden, the street, and even his usual walking route, and he was nowhere to be found. Sheila was shaking, and I remember having to calm her down. Sheila's husband had CCTV installed around the house, and more importantly, down on the gate posts at the bottom of the drive. He was always paranoid, but more so about the kids playing in the garden. While Derek, if that was even his real name, was in the house looking at the table, he was actually the distraction, or decoy if you will. Once inside, the two other men came up the drive and went around to the back door, which was unlocked. They took Bruno from his bed and put him in the car. We assumed that once they were done, that's who texted Derek, which explains why he left so abruptly. We called the police, and they came to gather the footage and a statement of what happened. Sheila was mortified. Bruno was a beloved family pet that the children had throughout their entire childhood. After reviewing the home CCTV system, we found an unclear image of the back of the car and license plate. We thought maybe the police would have some enhancement software and maybe zoom in and clear it up enough to read. 3 weeks went by, and we heard nothing. On the morning of Christmas Eve, Sheila received a phone call from the police. They had managed to locate the car, and upon visiting the home address, found 7 dogs that had been reported missing, including Bruno. The police wouldn't divulge a lot of information to us at the time, but said these guys were professionals. They had been watching the house, and had photos of the house, Bruno, and even the children found on one of their phones. We were able to go collect him later that day, and Sheila, the children, and even myself were all ecstatic to have Bruno back. Nothing is more important at Christmas than family, and Bruno was family. We gave all the evidence we had to the police, including the pictures we had listed of the table. When looking at these, there was something we noticed which we hadn't noticed before. Bruno was in the background of one of the photos. This happened to me when I was 12, so almost 10 years ago. I went to our local mall with my mom, dad, and little sister. We were there to buy clothes for our upcoming vacation. I hated it. I was always made to try on clothes that I didn't like because my mom thought I looked cool. I was easy to shop for. Jeans and plain black t-shirts were my go-to, but I was never allowed to stay home. I think my mom cared more about us having a family day out together than actually shopping. Now that I'm older, I can appreciate why she would force us all out together, but at the time, I really didn't want to be there. I would complain and moan about anything and everything. Me and my sister would play this game to kill time and stop the boredom. If you made your forefinger and thumb into a circle and held it below your waist, you'd get to punch the other person if you can trick them into looking at it. At first it's pretty easy to trick someone, as they're not really expecting it, but the more you trick each other, the more creative you have to be, and the harder the punches get when you're caught out. We had been playing this game for most of the day when I hit my sister a little harder than I probably should have. She started crying, which resulted in my mom shouting at me and telling me to grow up. I shouted something back about how it was always me that got into trouble, and I walked off to sit on the benches outside the store. After waiting there for about 10 minutes, I started to need the toilet. I wasn't really supposed to walk off on my own, especially going to the bathrooms. Mom would say, "You never know who's lurking." Up until the age of 10, she used to take me into the women's toilets until she was told by a member of staff that I was too old to be in there. I looked around and decided to just run in and run back out again. I'd probably be back before they even knew I was gone. There was a long hall that led around to the men's toilets. As I walked in, a man was walking out with a dark green jacket on. He looked me right in the eyes as he walked past. As a kid, he looked kind of scary. He had scruffy hair and a beard. He didn't smell overly pleasant either. Sometimes you'd see homeless people coming into the mall to use the toilet facilities. They were occasionally escorted out if seen by the mall security guards because they would wash their socks and underwear in the sink. These toilets were pretty close to an entrance that led out to the parking lot, so they could get in and out without being seen, for the most part at least. I didn't know if this guy was homeless, but he certainly looked and smelled like he was. I looked behind me as I went into the toilet, and the man was walking out. He didn't even look back. I went into one of the stalls, lifted the toilet seat, and started to relieve myself, when halfway through, I saw a flash. I didn't see where it came from, but I looked around. I couldn't see anything, so I continued to look when I saw a hand come over the top of the stall, holding a camera. Someone was trying to take my picture. I didn't really see much other than the cuff of their jacket. It was the same color as the guy who looked at me as he walked out the toilets just a few moments before. I didn't even get a chance to finish pulling my jeans up and running out of there. I ran to find my mom and dad, who were at the bench looking for me, talking to one of the security there. I had splashed myself, and it was showing up pretty obviously on my blue jeans. My mom asked me what had happened, and when I told her, my dad ran straight into the toilets. The security guard tried to grab him, but no way would my dad let this guy try to get away. The security guard shouted for assistance on his radio and ran in after my dad. Both the security guard and my dad came out a few minutes later. They had checked the toilets, and they were empty. He must have managed to escape there before I did. The police were called in, and I had to give a statement and a description of the man I saw. I wasn't even confident it was him. They were able to pull some footage off the CCTV they had in the mall to add to a watch list. A few months later, my mom got a call. One of the security guards that was there that day saw the man, and upon recognizing him, he followed him into the toilet. He was caught in the act taking a photo over the stall to some other unsuspecting kid. He was arrested, and the police checked his home to find a number of photographs of young boys, including myself. We were summoned to attend court at the trial, but I was never called into the witness stand. The man pleaded guilty to all charges. I think he's out of prison now, but as a registered sex offender. On reflection, and now I'm a bit older, I don't think he meant to use the flash, but ultimately, it was the flash that gave him away. My mom was right to be worried. You just never know who's lurking.
I had just graduated university and was drowning in student debt, so I decided to move in with my older brother Max until I could afford a place of my own. The last time I'd actually seen him was 5 years ago, at his wedding. He'd married this awful woman named Naomi. I knew at the time that she was a gold digger, but I was too afraid to say anything. After the wedding, Max cut off all contact with me and the rest of our family, all thanks to Naomi. I didn't hear from him again until after they'd divorced, but even then, he wasn't the same. It was like his spirit was broken. Honestly, I was surprised that he agreed to let me move in. I was hoping that living together would help us reconnect, but I was wrong. After staying with him for a month, I'd only seen him maybe 4 or 5 times. He spent all day and night working in his office. We were living in the same house, but it was like he was a complete stranger. We didn't even eat together. Then, one night, I was in the kitchen when he came downstairs and said that he had to run some errands. I thought that was really strange because it was 11 o'clock at night. I tried to ask him where he was going, but he said he didn't have time to explain. He reminded me once more to stay out of his office, and then he ran out of the house. The next morning, I noticed that his car wasn't in the driveway. I tried calling him, but he didn't answer. I could hear his phone ringing from inside his office, meaning that he'd left it behind. I knew I wasn't supposed to go in there, but I didn't have a choice. I was worried about him. So I opened the office door, surprised that he'd left it unlocked. All the lights were off, but his computer screen was still glowing. He'd kept his browser open, and it was clear that he'd gotten into some weird dark web stuff. I saw some sort of web page, mostly black, with a couple dozen tiny logos of different weapons, everything from ropes to explosives. 4 of the weapons were highlighted: chains, a baseball bat with nails sticking out, 2 different knives, and a blowtorch. Those were the ones he'd selected, and at the bottom of the screen was an address and a price: 600 bitcoins. I took a photo on my phone and then ran to my car. If my brother was mixed up in something illegal, I had to stop him. Armed with some mace, I drove to the address, which was an old warehouse just outside town. The place looked completely abandoned, except for Mark's car parked behind some dumpsters. I instantly regretted not calling the police. This was not a safe place, but it was too late now. I had to go inside and see for myself. I crawled through a gap in the chain-link fence and found a side entrance that was unlocked. Very quietly, I snuck inside. The inside of the warehouse was divided into several dark rooms, each filled with old factory equipment and metal cages. It was very quiet, except for a soft clinking of chains from somewhere in the back. I followed that sound until I made it to a metal door. I gathered up my courage and stepped inside. Right away, I saw a woman chained to the floor. Half of her face was horribly burned, but I could still recognize her. This was Naomi, Max's ex-wife. She was so out of it that she didn't notice me at first. In front of her was a table covered with the weapons that Max had ordered on his computer: the knives, the baseball bat, and the flamethrower. I was so disgusted by what I saw that I was frozen in place. Suddenly, Naomi's chains banged against the ground. She'd seen me. She reached forward, silently begging me for help, and I saw that 2 of her fingers looked broken. What had Max done to her? I scooped up the key on the table and ran to Naomi. I had to free her. I crouched down and asked her what was going on. She tried to answer, but I couldn't really understand. Still, I didn't need an explanation to know that Max had spent all night torturing her. With her fingerless hand, she gestured toward a door to the side. I assumed that Max was in there. I had to get her free before he came back. My hands shaking, I unlocked her chains and helped her stand up. She mumbled something at me that sounded a bit like, "Hurry." As I guided her toward the exit, I heard the door open behind us. Max was wearing a welder's mask over his face. He ran to us. I wanted to think that he wouldn't attack his own sister, but after what he'd done to Naomi, I didn't know what he was capable of. He was running at full speed. Without thinking, I grabbed the baseball bat on the table and swung it into his stomach. The nails dug into him, and he instantly crumpled to the ground. Had I killed my own brother? I felt terrible. But when I pulled off the mask, I saw that it wasn't Max at all. It was a total stranger, obviously the hitman that he'd hired online. But then, where was Max? Naomi kept gesturing toward the side room, so I stepped over the body and peered inside. There was Max, asleep on the couch. He was smiling. I guess he just wanted to stay here while the hitman tortured his ex-wife. I pulled out my phone to call 911, but Naomi touched my shoulder. "Go," she tried to say. She looked at me, her one good eye pleading. That's when I made an awful choice. "Okay," I said, and I left her there. As I walked out of the warehouse, I looked over my shoulder and saw Naomi grab the blowtorch. When I was outside, I called the police, and as I waited for them to come, I could hear someone, a man, screaming through the walls.
I just moved back to my hometown in Arizona after a decade of trying to make it as a costume designer in LA. My hometown is a lot cheaper than LA, so I was able to work as a waiter and make enough money for a pretty good place. Overall, it was an okay situation, but I was still depressed that I had given up on my dream. All my childhood friends had moved away, so I needed to figure out how to meet new people. I signed up for a local cinema club, where people would meet once a week to get drinks and watch classic films at this really run-down art house theater not too far from my place. I was a bit nervous about it, because I'm not great at socializing, but when I got there,
I met the organizer and a couple other people who seemed really excited for new blood. I also met this woman named Tanya, who seemed a bit too eager to be my friend. She said she was a costume designer too. She worked on a bunch of local plays. More than that, she said that she was an aspiring filmmaker and was planning to self-fund a low-budget horror movie. Her goal, as mine had been, was to make it big in LA. I had a weird feeling about her, but I figured that she could maybe hook me up with a side job or something. So when it came time for our group to watch the movie, we ended up sitting together. About 30 minutes in, she left to use the bathroom. She was gone for a while, and when she came back, she looked like she was in shock. Her face was pale, and she couldn't stop shaking. She sat back down and whispered that a man in a ski mask had attacked her in the bathroom. She showed me a fresh cut along her arm where the man had slashed her with a knife. I couldn't believe this. This was a sleepy desert town. That kind of thing would never happen here. I asked her why she didn't call the police. She said she did. The police would get here in 5 minutes, but she was too afraid to wait in the lobby alone. She asked if I'd wait with her until the cops came. I didn't understand why she didn't want to tell the others. If there was a psychopath somewhere in the theater, shouldn't she tell everyone? She explained that the man had run off. None of us were in immediate danger, and she didn't want to ruin the movie for everyone else. I was reluctant to go with her. I barely knew her, but she seemed so panicked and helpless that I eventually agreed. We snuck back into the lobby, which was completely empty. The 3 workers that had been there when we entered were nowhere to be seen. Almost immediately, a policeman walked in. His badge said that his name was Officer Bradford. He listened as Tanya told him the story that she had told me. He nodded gravely, explaining that there had been other reports in this area of a man wearing a ski mask who attacked women. He assured her that they'd find him, as long as she came down to the station to give them all the information she had. Tanya quickly agreed, but then she asked if I could come with them. I told them that I didn't see anything, but the officer said that any information could help them. He made it seem like I didn't have a choice. I had to go with them. Afraid to argue with a cop, I followed Tanya and Officer Bradford into the parking lot. Right away, I knew that something was wrong. He was leading us toward a windowless van, not a cop car. The officer noticed my concern and said that the van was for undercover operations. He tapped on his badge and told me to trust him. That's when I noticed that his badge was larger than it should have been, and it lacked a badge number. As a costume designer, I knew what a real police badge looked like, and his was definitely fake. Looking closer, I realized that his uniform used the wrong fabric and had several inaccurate markings. Officer Bradford wasn't a real cop at all. Acting casually, I pulled Tanya aside and whispered that we had to run back inside. She looked at me for a long moment, and then shouted at the fake policeman, "Get him!" The officer ran toward me, but I raced back inside and blocked the entrance with a trash can. Tanya and the man pounded on the glass doors and demanded that I let them in. I pushed against the trash can to make sure they couldn't get inside, and with my free hand, I called 911 and told them that someone was impersonating an officer. When I looked back out the windows, I saw Tanya and Officer Bradford give up and walk back to the van. When they slid open the door, I could see other people inside. Very quickly, the van drove off. When the real police came, I explained exactly what happened. With his help, we were able to piece together that Tanya had never been attacked at all. She and that officer had used the story as an excuse to lure me outside and kidnap me. I didn't know what their ultimate plan was, but I remembered that she told me about a horror movie she wanted to make. Was that the reason? Did she want to use me for some kind of snuff film? After the officer got all my information, he said they'd find them, but there's still been no update. And the worst part is that the 3 theater workers have been missing ever since.
As I was a poor college student, I worked as many hours as I could to help pay for school. Unfortunately, this meant that the only place I could get groceries and other necessary supplies was the local Walmart. It's not so bad during the day when you have tons of people there, but at night, when everyone is safely tucked into bed behind locked doors, it was arguably the creepiest place in town. Normally, I would go in and get what I needed and get out, but one night I had several things to do, so it was late before I got to the store. This was back in the pre-COVID days, when Walmart was open 24 hours a day. I didn't even see any employees when I entered, which sent a chill up my spine. However, as time passed and I collected my items, the more I relaxed. I had always had an active imagination, so it wasn't unusual for me to jump at unknown noises and sights. I was maybe 3/4 of the way through my list when I got the odd sense that I was being followed. When I looked over my shoulder, I saw that nobody was there. Thinking it was my overactive imagination, I ignored it. Some 20 minutes later, the feeling came over me again, so when I looked again, I saw that again nobody was there. Thinking that I needed some coffee, I walked towards the front where the 24-hour McDonald's was selling coffee. I was halfway there when I felt the sensation that I was being followed again. When I turned to look, again nobody was there. Now seriously spooked, I picked up speed and ran towards the front where I got some coffee and a large fry. While I was waiting for my fry and my coffee, I heard the squeaky PA system call out for an employee. This made me feel a little bit better, knowing that at least there was somebody out there. I took my coffee and my fry and continued to shop. I had finished getting the last of my things when I felt the odd sensation that I was being followed again. Now, fed up, I snapped my head around, ready to give whoever it was that was stalking me a piece of my mind. Standing at the end of the aisle and staring at me was a clown. No, I'm not making this up. It was like the ones that were on the news a few years ago during the creepy clown scares. His face was caked with white makeup, and he wore a red wig that puffed out like a balloon. He was also wearing a yellow clown costume. I just stood there and stared at this creep. He took one step towards me. Grabbing my bag and abandoning my cart laden with items, I took off running. I didn't stop until I was in my car. Even then, I put the pedal to the metal and sped off towards home. I didn't feel safe until I was safe behind a locked door and safely tucked in bed. I was so rattled that I didn't tell anyone for a couple of days. That was until I was watching the news and saw something that made my blood run cold with fear. A Walmart employee was followed home and attacked by some creep in a clown costume. Wondering if there was some sort of connection, I called the police tip line and let them know about my scare. Apparently, my tip had caused something of a stir because I was asked to come in for a formal interview. I went in and told them everything that I knew. When I asked why they were so curious about my lead, they disclosed something that hadn't been revealed to the public yet. During the initial search of the store, police found a yellow clown costume not far from where the employee was attacked. When I was shown the clown costume, I positively identified it as the same one the creep that was stalking me was wearing. Not long after, they caught the perpetrator. It turned out the guy had a history of stalking girls like myself and the Walmart employee that he ended up attacking. Police theorized that I was his intended target that night, but when I took off running, he decided to stalk someone else. The poor girl just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's been over 10 years since this whole ordeal happened, and I have still never stepped foot inside a Walmart since then. It took me a long time to get over the guilt I felt about that poor girl who was attacked instead of me that night. I still have nightmares about being stalked by that creep in the yellow clown costume.
I met this man, William, through an online dating app 3 years ago. We had been seeing each other for about 4 months, but nothing was exclusive. He told me he had recently got out of an abusive relationship and asked if we could take things slow. That was fine with me, as most men you meet on dating apps just want to try and get you straight into bed. I was still talking to a few other people from the apps, both male and female, but mainly as friends. William was the perfect gentleman in every way. He would open the door for me. He would pay the check when we went out to restaurants. But he also wasn't afraid to let me reciprocate and pick up the tab if I said it was my turn to get this. Valentine's Day was about a week away, and he asked me to be his Valentine and said he would make sure it was very special. It was a bit out of character for him, but I agreed. I was also talking to this girl, Eleanor, who was a couple of years younger than me. Eleanor was very pretty and had an alternative yet stylish look to her. She would throw me compliments and tell me she preferred women who were a few years older than her, as they were more on her level of intellect. I'd met her a couple of times for coffee, and she was intelligent for her age and always brought interesting topics up for discussion. I wasn't really into girls, but it's always nice to learn someone finds you attractive. She asked me what I was doing for Valentine's Day and if I was seeing anyone. I explained to her that I did have plans, but I was happy to meet for a coffee or something in the morning. I didn't really think of it as a date, as I had mentioned previously that I was in a non-exclusive relationship. I suppose looking back, that doesn't make much sense and could confuse a person. On the morning of Valentine's Day, I met up with Eleanor, and we had breakfast together. I told her all about William and the night we had planned. I wanted to be honest and open, and told her I was hoping that William was going to ask me to go exclusive tonight, but his crazy ex had put him off relationships, so I was doubtful that it would happen. Out of nowhere, Eleanor had this sudden outburst that all men are pigs and they don't deserve women. I had never seen this side to Eleanor, and it really put me on edge. She went on to say that there was always two sides to the story. The way she was going on, I started to get the feeling that she knew William's ex. I left, saying I had to go as I was meeting another friend, but Eleanor didn't believe me. It was blatantly obvious that I was lying to get out of the uncomfortable situation. I walked away and didn't look back. I met William that night as normal, and we went out to the movie theater, then for a meal, and then back to my place. We were hanging out on the couch and talking over a few glasses of wine when both of our cell phones received notifications at exactly the same time. We both looked at each other at the coincidence and both checked our messages. We had both received the same picture message from an unknown number. Then another message came through, and then another. These were all photos of us that night. Someone was following us around and taking pictures of us in all these different places. Then we received another. It was a picture of us both sitting on the couch, but the scary part was, the photo was taken from inside the house. From the top of the stairs more specifically, meaning that someone was upstairs. I wanted to leave immediately, but William insisted that we check upstairs. "It's probably my ex Eleanor. Don't worry, I can handle her." William had never told me her name before. To be honest, he didn't tell me much about her. I pulled out my cell and showed a photograph of my friend Eleanor. It was the same person. Eleanor was William's ex. I had this bad feeling and begged William to leave the house and call the police. The police were called, and when they arrived, there was no sign of Eleanor, but my bedroom carpet was found to have been soaked in some kind of flammable liquid. I think she was trying to lure us upstairs so she could set it alight with us all in it. Eleanor was arrested later that night, but there was nothing to prove it was her, so she was let go. I decided to stay away from William after that night, for my own safety.
Mrs. Ford is an old widow, probably somewhere in her 70s, though I find that the older a person is, the harder it is to tell their age. She has been me and my roommate's next-door neighbor since we moved in during sophomore year, and as far as we could tell, she's been living in the same two-bedroom apartment for multiple decades. We share one wall with Mrs. Ford. Thankfully, it's one of the living room walls, so none of us ever had to worry the old lady would hear anything inappropriate, like we would if we shared a wall to one of the bedrooms. When we first moved in, complete with our scarce secondhand furniture and my cat Miller, I thought it was weird that the previous tenants had left a few items in the place. A dresser in one of the bedrooms, some kitchen utensils, and notably, a huge mirror hanging on the living room wall. But since my roommates and I were barely adults, and thus didn't have many possessions to our name, we kind of appreciated that. The day we moved in, Mrs. Ford had brought us a freshly baked apple pie as a housewarming gesture, and told us about the apartment building's glory days. A week after we'd moved in, one of my roommate's parents got into a car accident and needed her at the hospital. She broke the news to us, packed an overnight bag, and left. The next day, there was Mrs. Ford at our door with a casserole she had made. She said she had had a terrible dream about someone getting hurt, and she had just wanted to come by and make sure everyone was okay. I thought it was kind of a weird coincidence that she'd had a dream like that the same night as my roommate's parents' car accident, But in the end, I thought maybe she'd overheard us talking and subconsciously dreamed about it. But then, there was Mrs. Ford at our doorstep again, holding a 6-pack of beer and smiling, the same morning we decided to throw a small party in our apartment for our college friends. We hadn't even told anybody yet. I started to have the eerie feeling that maybe the old woman was listening in on our conversations. So my roommates and I devised a plan. We started saying random, false things out loud in the living room, and writing the real messages on a whiteboard we hung on the opposite wall as the mirror. When we said, "I'm doing laundry today," we wrote "laundry tomorrow" on the whiteboard. When I said, "It's my birthday in 1 week," I wrote "my birthday's in 3 days." Sure, it was small things, and it wouldn't have been the end of the world if the old woman was listening in. But it was the principle of the thing. We had a right to privacy, and we wanted to know if we were being robbed of it. But here's the thing. Mrs. Ford always knew the truth. As though by magic, there she was folding our laundry in the building's communal laundry room. And there she was too, holding a shakily frosted cake at our doorstep on my birthday. So as unlikely as it felt, we learned to accept that Mrs. Ford just knew things, that she might be some sort of psychic or seer or something funky like that. Until one night, when I was watching an old comedy with my roommates and eating copious amounts of popcorn. It was that movie The Parent Trap, with young Lindsay Lohan playing the twins. We were at the part when the evil, soon-to-be stepmom goes hiking with the family, and the twins manage to get her to put a lizard in her mouth. We all giggled. But when we fell quiet again, our hairs stood on end. We could hear the sound of giggling coming from the other side of the wall we shared with Mrs. Ford. We glanced at each other, trying not to show outwardly that we'd heard it. Did we have an intruder? Were we in danger? I waited a minute, then stood up slowly and walked to the opposite wall, where the mirror hung over the table by the front door, where my phone had been charging. I wanted to have my phone near me, in case we needed to call 911. In the movie, the evil stepmom woke up with her mattress floating on a lake. My roommates laughed nervously, trying to give the impression that nothing was wrong. There it was again, the giggling from the other side of the wall. But this time, I heard where it came from. It came from the mirror. I grabbed the edges of the mirror and lifted it off the wall. Behind it, on the white painted concrete, I saw a small hole the size of a bottle cap, and through the hole, my neighbor's apartment. She must have seen me take the mirror down and move out of the way so I couldn't see her. As I looked at the mirror, I realized that it was a two-way mirror, and she had been watching us the entire time. Growing up in the middle of nowhere, anytime something big happened around town, we all took part. It was a tradition in our family to go to the lake and watch the fireworks explode above the water, creating a cascade of sparkling colors. However, on one 4th of July, when I was 17, my parents ruined that plan. Their decision to leave me at home with my younger brother infuriated me. It also inadvertently ruined future 4th of July festivities to come. Our parents had left us at home to go to a family friend's wedding that night. While they told us to stay home, I simply couldn't let that happen. I was 17 after all. I felt like I could handle taking my 6-year-old sibling to see some fireworks. Plus, I had my own car, and as long as I was back before my parents, no problem. They would never know. So, that was my plan. I was going to take my brother out with me, and we would enjoy the fireworks alone. At first, he was less than enthused. He wasn't a rule breaker, but after some time of wearing him down, he agreed. We left for the lake right before the festivities got started. Arriving at the parking lot, the place was brimming with people. It felt like hours before we found somewhere to park at the very back of the lot. It was dark and secluded, but we were together, so it was okay. Our town was small, and I had no reason to be concerned. We made it inside and took a seat towards the corner of the lake, where I could still keep my eyes on my brother without him getting lost in a crowd. We stayed in our little corner, full of wonder as we stared up. It was a cacophony of music and explosions, and we both loved it. It was already nightfall by the time they took a small intermission, and my brother decided to wait until then to go to the restroom, naturally. When I looked around, the restroom seemed to be a straight shot, so I figured I'd just wait and let him go, and I'd watch from where we were seated. Off to the right of us, I heard screaming, and it sounded like a fight, so instinctively I looked that way. When I turned around, I couldn't see my brother anymore. It was a sea of people, all rushing towards the restrooms and food trucks that had made their way out front. I hopped up onto my feet quicker than I think I have ever moved and started to speed walk to the front of the gates by the restrooms, trying to find my brother. I couldn't see anything. Everyone was wearing the same colors, so that made it even more complicated. I made it to the restrooms, and when I peered inside, he wasn't there. I even asked another man to check the stalls. Still nothing. It wasn't until I stepped to the corner of the bathroom building that I saw him wandering into the trees with some stranger. I didn't hesitate or even think. I screamed his name and took off running. I ran until I felt like I couldn't run anymore, and then I kept going. I was losing him, and I had to stop to breathe as I made it to the tree line. I called out to him as loud as I could and started running again, just following the most open path. Then, the fireworks started back up. A brief explosion illuminated the view ahead, just long enough that I could see my brother and a man. It felt like I followed them forever when I got close enough to make out what the man looked like. I was shocked to see that he was an older gentleman. He wasn't middle-aged like I initially thought. He was walking slow and with a stooped posture, slower than the average person. I had a strange feeling around that time. I didn't understand why my brother was still around this strange man. He was young enough that he could easily outrun him, but he wasn't. I wasn't sure what was going on with the situation, but I didn't like it. I ran up behind, shouting at my brother, and grabbed his arm, pulling him away from the man. I expected the man to push me away or attack me or something, but nothing, if anything. He looked scared at how angry I was. I was confused. My brother was trying to talk, and when I finally gave him the time of day to speak, he told me that he was helping the man find his way back to his cabin. I realized quite fast how strange this all was, but I decided to not argue with a stranger in the middle of the woods. I pushed my brother in front of me and directed them both back the way we came. I didn't have any good feelings about the ordeal. The entire way back, the man stayed silent. I asked questions about who he was, but he wouldn't say anything about himself. It wasn't until we made it to the clearing that I realized how wrong things really were. Just as we approached, the man put his hand on my back, shoving me so hard that I tripped, and me and my brother fell face first to the ground. From the grassy area beneath me, I watched as this stranger ran full speed, his age no longer an issue. I watched the man disappear into the crowd. I made sure my brother was okay, and after all of that, we left. I was scared, and I didn't want to disobey anymore, so we went back home. It wasn't until a few days later that I heard that some other kid was almost abducted from the play park. The description matched the man who had taken my brother. I have no idea of his intentions, and when I told my parents about what happened, they were mad at me, but just relieved we were both safe.
This happened when I was back in junior high and involved me and 3 of my friends, Kyle, Dibley, and Asa. Our school had been closed down as it was structurally unsafe, and we were transferred to another school while ours was demolished and rebuilt. Our school had a basement in it that led all under the school. There were rumors that there were rooms that had been locked, and no one had entered them for years. Apparently, these rooms held records of past students and incidents, which I thought would be quite fascinating to find and look at. My friends and I decided that we wanted to go check it out and go exploring. Although the school was unsafe, it was unlikely to fall down without some assistance. We decided to all sneak out of the house and meet up at about 10 p.m., as it would be dark and our parents would most likely be in bed. I told my parents I wasn't feeling well and was going to get an early night. I never got into any trouble as a kid, so my mom and dad wouldn't question me going to bed early and sneaking out. I met my friends in the woods near our school. We took torches and masks and remember it feeling like we were on some secret mission or something. As the school had been closed down for a few weeks by this point, a lot of the windows and doors had been vandalized and smashed, which made it easy for us to get in. We got into the old school by climbing through a broken window that had been boarded up. We were able to lift the corner of the board up enough for us to get in. We wandered around the school, checking out the principal's office, cafeteria, kitchen, and other various rooms that were off limits to students. It was really surreal to walk around, and once we'd explored everywhere upstairs, it was time to explore the basement. The lights wouldn't work, as all the electricity had been shut off to the school, and with no windows to let in any light from the moon and any lighting outside, it was pitch black. The basement entrance had previously been padlocked, but it was broken off like someone had beat us to it, meaning anything cool to take would probably already have been taken. At the back of one of the rooms, we found an old piano. We pressed a few of the keys to see if it still worked, which it did, but sounded like it hadn't been tuned in years. We walked around the rest of the rooms in the basement, not really finding anything exciting, just a bunch of old school equipment, like sports gear and old files which were empty. We decided to call it a night, and as we were walking up the stairs, we heard a faint sound coming from deep inside the basement. It was the piano. Someone was playing the keys on the piano. Me and my friends all looked at each other, scared and curious. We took a vote on whether we were going to go downstairs and see what was hitting the piano. Asa and Kyle voted to go home, and Dibley and I voted to go check it out. As it was a tie vote, Dibley and I said we would go and check it out together, while Asa and Kyle waited at the top of the basement stairs. We went into the room where the piano was playing. As we approached the door to the room, the playing stopped. We shone our flashlights around the room, but couldn't see anyone or anything. We joked, saying maybe it was a rat or something running across the keys. As we turned to walk out of the basement, we heard a shuffle come from the back corner of the room. I shone my flashlight and saw a man. I didn't have a chance to get a good look at him before he started screaming and started charging towards us. Dibley and I ran towards the stairs, shouting at Asa and Kyle to run. We ran to the classroom where we climbed into the school. My friends climbed out of the window, and as I was halfway through the window, the man grabbed my leg and bit me on my calf. I screamed and managed to kick and pull away as my friends pulled me from the outside. We ran off into the woods, and as soon as we were sure we weren't being followed, I stopped to look at my leg. The man had drawn blood and left teeth marks on my calf. I don't know who that man was, but he never followed us out. I had to go home and tell my parents, and they took me to the hospital. They notified the police, who checked the school but didn't find anyone. We couldn't really give a description, so the man was never caught. The school was demolished 3 weeks later. This happened last September. Me and my girlfriend of 2 years wanted to take a trip out to Ohio. We had seen some log cabins out there on Airbnb that were kind of out in the sticks. The log cabin we eventually decided on was in an ideal location and had access to lots of nature walks with local creeks and hiking trails. The living room and kitchen was open plan with a small ensuite bedroom in the back. It was our first real trip together, and when the day came, we drove the 5 hours it took to get there, making a few stops along the way. We set off early so we could make the most of the day and see what's around before we settled for the night. We arrived a few hours before check-in, so decided to park the car and walk to this waterfall we heard was a must-visit. The waterfall was relatively easy to find. We had downloaded a map off some review site before we left home, and there was little room for error. Just don't stray off the path. There was no one else around when we arrived at the waterfall, so we decided to take a dip in the shallow part of the water. There were signs saying no swimming, but a lot of the personal comments on the review site said it was safe to do so and just stick to the shallow end. As the day got on, the temperature started to drop and the clouds indicated that there might be some rain soon, and I certainly didn't want to get caught out in it. We got out, got dressed, and headed back towards the car. As we approached the car, I noticed that my front left tire was flat. My initial thought was that I'd punctured it while driving, but I noticed a slash in the tire, like someone had taken to it with a hunting knife. It was starting to get dark, so I had to be quick to change the tire.
It was a fair distance to walk back to the cabin, and we had all our food and clothes still in the car, which would have been too much to carry just the two of us. We arrived at the cabin just after dark. I was exhausted, and we decided we would just make something to eat and then go to bed and unpack in the morning. We both slept right through until the next morning. My girlfriend was the first one up and went into the kitchen area to make coffee. She screamed, and I went running in. Our belongings were thrown all over the room. Someone had been through all our belongings while we slept. It was like someone had been looking for something specific. If it was burglars, surely they would have just taken the bags. Why risk staying there to go through everything, knowing you might get caught? For all they knew, I could have been armed. My girlfriend suggested it was a wild animal, but I disregarded the comment. We were warned that bears were common at this time of year, as they're generally scavenging for food and preparing for hibernation. But this just didn't feel like an animal, and the kitchen was pretty much untouched. We contacted the Airbnb host, and he explained that this had never happened before, and asked us what we wanted to do. He offered us a partial refund, explaining that as the door wasn't broken, we must have left it unlocked, as he was the only other person with a key. Maybe we did leave it open. We were tired when we got home and didn't really overthink going to bed. We decided to stay and make the most of our holiday. We spent most of the day cleaning up the mess and sorting our clothes. We decided to just write the day off and chill at the cabin. There wasn't any internet, but there was a TV and a Blu-ray player with a good selection of films to watch, so we decided to light the log fire and watch a film. I joked about watching Cabin in the Woods, but my girlfriend didn't find it so funny, especially with what had happened the previous night. We went to bed and made sure all the doors and windows were locked. I woke in the middle of the night to a loud bang on the side of the cabin. I lay there, thinking it might just be a bear wandering around, which, I'm not going to lie, is scary in itself, especially when you're not used to seeing bears wandering around. Then I heard it again, but it was much louder. And then, again. And then I saw the shadow of two men walk by the bedroom window. Someone was outside. I woke my girlfriend and tried to get a service on my cell, but with no luck. These men weren't trying to be quiet. They were banging as they walked around the outside of the cabin. They wanted to be heard. Then I heard something I really did not expect. One of the men shouted my girlfriend's name. I looked at her, scared, and she just looked back at me. "How do they know your name?" I asked her. She said that maybe it's the people who came into the house yesterday, and perhaps they saw her driver's license. It made sense, so I thought no more of it. So now, we needed to figure out what they wanted. I decided to shout to them as they were walking past the window.
"What do you want? We don't have any money or anything valuable." "She knows what we want."
I was both scared and confused.
"Do you know these men?"
My girlfriend paused. She knew them all right. It was her ex-fiancé coming to collect the ring he gave her. Apparently, he had been trying to get it back for some time, and it was somewhat of a family heirloom. I didn't even know she'd been engaged, let alone still had the ring. They threatened to kick the door in if we didn't open it. They knew we were there, they knew who we were, and knew we had no way of calling the police or anyone. I let them in. They had some type of shotgun with them. I'm not sure exactly, as I've never really been a gun fanatic. Her ex-fiancé, Jason, looked me dead in the eye and told me he wasn't leaving without the ring, even if it meant leaving me for dead. Thankfully, Melanie had the ring and gave it back to protect me, but I could never look at her the same way again after that. Not only did she not tell me that she was engaged, she kept the ring, which meant a lot to this ex-fiancé of hers. I just couldn't stay with that type of person. The next day, we packed our things. I dropped her off at home, and I never saw her again.
As a police officer, I often get asked how I cope with the things I see. The answer is usually that I try to distance myself from things, try as best as I can to compartmentalize, to not bring some of the more horrible things I see back home with me. This is what I say. In truth, it always follows you home. Try as you might to put things to the back of your mind,
Certain cases and incidents will always haunt you. In my case, one in particular. The death of Darren Warner was a hard one to forget. His death was not some hideous murder perpetrated by some serial killer or some kidnapping that involved a grisly fate for the victim. His death was a road traffic accident involving another driver. He had slowed at the traffic lights to allow the cars going across the junction to pass when one car, driven by a teacher named Moss, mounted the curb, veered off its path, and ran at full speed into Darren. Darren wasn't killed instantly, but died of his injuries before he could be taken to a hospital. Of course, it was an outright tragedy. I'm not in any way denying that it was, but it was not a particularly unusual tragedy. Incidents and accidents like this one occur on major roads around the country every day. What did make this one extraordinary, what made it stick in my mind for years to come, was the footage. Initially, when my colleague Tristan and I ran through an interview with Moss, it was the same as many others we'd conducted in similar circumstances. The poor man sat with his head in his hands, sobbing at the thought of having taken a young man's life. He had tested negative for alcohol or any other substances that might have impaired his ability to drive, and when we asked whether he might have nodded off at the wheel, he shook his head violently and assured us that he was completely awake. Moss told us that he swerved to avoid someone who appeared out of nowhere in the middle of the road. It was an instinctual reaction to swerve. I remember Tristan placing his hand on Moss's shoulder, reassuring him that he didn't need to go on and that we'd come back to the questions later. Listening to Moss, it was difficult not to feel sorry for him. In some ways, though he had taken someone's life in an accident, he was also a victim. Trapped in a catch-22 situation, it's difficult to see what he could have done differently that would not have resulted in at least one person being killed or seriously injured. Or at least, that's how it seemed. Problem was, none of the witnesses at the scene mentioned a second man. According to them, Moss just swerved, for no reason, despite having a clear road in front of him, and drove straight into Warner, which of course changed matters a little. After 2 hours of leaving Moss in the interview room to reconsider his statement, I was grabbing a coffee when Tristan emerged from one of the side offices and beckoned me inside. From the look on his face, I could already tell whatever he was planning to show me, it wasn't going to be good. What James brought up for me on his open laptop was footage from Moss's dash cam. At first, I was relieved. The footage would make it clear one way or another whether Moss's second lad actually existed. What we saw, though, was far from clear. The footage showed the road to be entirely open, nothing but the white line and a few cars off in the distance. At first. Suddenly, however, seemingly from one frame to the next, a smudge, like a black thumbprint on the screen, seemed to appear from nowhere. Watching the footage back over and over, it was impossible to see where it could have materialized from. The figure, if you could call the shape that, did not walk into shot or grow larger as it approached. In one frame, it simply wasn't there. Then, in the next, it was. This in itself was unnerving, but worse still was the footage from Warner's helmet cam. Skipping through to the important points, James showed me Warner's footage, split into 2 viewpoints, one showing the road before him and one looking directly behind. Periodically, Tristan would pause the footage and point to the side of the road where a figure, indistinct and looking more like a black ink blot than an actual person, was standing. As Warner progressed up the road, this blurry figure was seen over and over at irregular intervals, simply standing at the side of the road. "It was following him," said Tristan softly. "Whatever that is, it was following him." When I went back in the room with Moss, I asked him if he got a good look at the man who had stepped out from nowhere and caused him to veer off the road. He said that he hadn't, but that, from what he did see, he could tell that the man was wearing a long dark coat with a hood. I think about that figure a lot, especially when I'm alone. I've often considered that it might have been a shadow or a glitch on the recording, though it seems unlikely that the same glitch would occur on 3 separate cameras.
I think about why it was pursuing Darren Warner moments before his death, and how it seemed to appear from nowhere and then simply disappear. These things are harder to compartmentalize. Of course, I can never say for sure what that dark thing was, but if it was what I think it was, then I'll probably be seeing it again someday, at least one more time.
We could say that I've always had pretty poor taste in men. It was just something that I had come to learn about myself. It was even a joke that I always had a savior complex and that I attracted people who wanted me to fix them. It had never really given me much of an issue. Normally, I could just break things off, and that was the end of it. We would go our own separate ways. No harm done. That was until I met my ex when I was 23. We can call him Logan. Logan was the one that checked all my boxes. He made me feel cared for, and I didn't think he had anything that needed fixing. I was smitten until it fell apart and the breakdown was drastic. Logan and I met when I was at my part-time job as a bartender in a local dive bar downtown. I was there solely to pay my bills as I tried to figure out what I wanted with my life and pay down some debt I accumulated from horrible use at credit cards. He hung around after last call to make sure he could get my cell number after the lights came on. It struck me as a sort of romantic gesture. He even slid in a smooth comment about how I was even prettier with the lights on. I didn't feel threatened by him, so I gave him my number because I figured, why not? He made sure not to text me until later that afternoon, claiming he knew that bartenders kept odd hours. The first date we had, he offered to go get coffee on my day off. From the jump, we got along really well. We seemed to bond over most of our hobbies, music, and even movies. It was bliss, until around the 2-month mark. The 2-month mark set off a chain of weird changes with Logan. The normally bubbly personality I knew began to morph into something darker. We began to argue any time I would go out with my own friend group. It would somehow turn into me not caring enough about him to spend time with him. Or, if I didn't reply to his text within 5 minutes, he would call my phone. I think the one that drove me insane was when I was working at the bar, he would come sit until my shifts would end. Slowly, it began to feel like I was being smothered or losing my own space. It was claustrophobic. Finally, after a month and a half of this behavior and telling myself it's just a phase, I had to call it off. That didn't help anything. If anything, it made it 50 times worse. The strange happenings started up without any downtime. The first thing that caused a giant red flag to wave was the fact that he sent me several texts that went unanswered. His response to that slight was to show up at my apartment when I came home from work. He was sitting down in front of my door, head leaned back into the door with his eyes closed. It looked like he had been there a while, camping out. I called his name as I walked up, and once I was close enough, I began to smell alcohol. Lots of cheap vodka. He stood up on wobbly legs and began to scream that I was ungrateful. The scene caused me a lot of concern. He seemed unhinged. I could barely make out most of what he was saying. I could see spittle flying from his mouth. It took me promising to talk to him if he would go home and sober up before he finally left. I watched him leave and quickly barricaded myself in the apartment. The next morning, 2 of my neighbors gave me their number and told me they would be on the lookout. Needless to say, that was the tip-top of the embarrassment meter. He didn't stop there. No, it just kept coming. Next, he began to stake out my workplace. The worst part was that he was obvious about it. He knew that I worked in customer service and used it as a weapon against me. I would be behind the bar, and he would come in as a customer and repeatedly get me to serve him his drinks. I wasn't the type to cause problems, so I did my best to ignore it. I didn't see the point in creating a fuss. I could see him taking some form of sick gratification in watching me squirm. He would even go so far as to tell men that would talk to me that I was taken and that my boyfriend wasn't the type to share. Thankfully, Most of the guys knew what was going on and collectively ignored him, which got under his skin. I would like to think that if it stopped there, that I would have been fine, but then it went into scarier territory. While him sitting at my job was annoying, I could have handled that. The last straw for me came when I was driving home from a friend's house, and in my rearview mirror, I saw a car following me. I took care to make several random turns to check, but I could never shake them. I had a feeling of dread that was sitting in my gut like a rock. I did my best to keep calm, and instead of going home, I drove my car and parked at the police department. I wasn't shocked to see that the car kept going straight past me. Through the window, I could make out the outline of someone in a ball cap, slinked back into the seat. As the car turned, I made my way back to my apartment and creeped through the lot, making sure that if he was there, I didn't miss his car. It felt insane to have to do this, but I was out of options. The lot didn't have anything resembling his car, so when I went inside, I made sure to lock up before I did anything else. The rest of the night flew by as normal. I did some laundry, ate some awful ramen, and fell asleep with my laptop open, watching reruns of Law & Order. The next time I woke up was to a crashing noise. It was so alarming because it wasn't from the streets below. It was coming from inside my house. What I heard was my pots and pans crashing throughout the kitchen. I felt completely frozen. I knew I would have to get up to reach my phone at the least. I felt like a kid wanting to hide my face beneath the covers. With my room still dark, I lightly set my feet down on the carpet and crept over towards where I left my phone. In the dark, I ran my hand along the dresser and started to panic when I realized my phone wasn't there. I had found the charging cable, but it wasn't connected to anything. I felt myself begin to hyperventilate. Carefully, I walked to my bedroom door and put my face to the crack in the door, looking out into the hall. No sooner than I put my face forward to look, my hallway light flicked on, and I was staring at Logan's face. He kicked my door open while holding my phone and waved it in my face, cracking jokes that he was able to get into my room as I slept in order to take it. I had to think fast and resorted to what I had done the first night and tried to talk him down. My attempts seemed to be in vain, and he continued to scream in my face and throw my things around my place while screaming how awful I was for leaving. I was beginning to flounder in my efforts, running out of ideas to dig myself out of this situation. I could feel the fight leaving. My last attempt turned out to be me kicking my wall as hard as I could in hopes of alerting my neighbor. A few seconds went by and nothing happened. I felt defeated. His rants kept going, and they were gradually getting more ludicrous. I kept watching and waiting for him to snap. I imagined he was almost there when I heard banging on my door. I felt my heartbeat increase when I heard them announce themselves as the police. Taking hold of what control I still had, I screamed. It took Logan off guard, and right as he lunged at me, my door was kicked open. I don't remember much else after that, fortunately. My therapist says that I likely blocked it out, which I am still okay with. It wasn't until much later that I was informed that the police searched his car and found ropes, ties, and knives. Since then, I've moved states. I've put as much distance between myself and Logan as I could. I still don't touch social media, and I don't bartend anymore. Anytime I start to get bad vibes from men now, I just leave. I don't give it time to go that far. I was babysitting my neighbor's son Grady a few nights ago. He was a little terror, but his mom paid pretty well. I watched him a few times before, and I knew that the best way to control him was to keep him eating. Otherwise, he'd just run around the house and break things. That night, he was particularly wild, so I said that I'd order whatever pizza he wanted if he promised to calm down. That seemed to work. I called the restaurant and ordered a pepperoni pizza with pineapples and extra garlic. It sounded disgusting, but that was what Grady wanted. The man who took my order seemed pretty normal at first, but when I told him what toppings I wanted, he gasped and wouldn't say anything for a long time.
Then his voice got all shaky, and he asked if there was anything else I needed. I finished the order and hung up. The guy had given me the creeps, but I quickly forgot about it and went back to watching Grady. We waited about 20 minutes until the delivery guy arrived. I opened the door and saw a middle-aged man holding the pizza. He looked too old to be a delivery guy, but he was wearing the uniform. When he said hello, I recognized his voice from the phone. I reached for the pizza, but he pulled it away. He asked if I was home alone tonight. I told him that the house was filled with people. I grabbed the pizza and basically threw the money at him. Then I closed the door. As we were eating, Grady asked me why I was so upset. I guess I had a panicked look on my face. I told him that there wasn't anything to worry about, but then I heard the floorboards creak from the other room. It sounded like the delivery man had snuck inside the house. I grabbed Grady's hand and led him into the downstairs bathroom. Then I told him to lock the door behind me and wait there until I said he could come out. He didn't seem nervous. In fact, all he cared about was getting more pizza. I left him in the bathroom, hoping that the lock on the door would keep him safe, and then I went to grab my phone. I walked through the hallway and living room, looking around for signs of anyone. The whole house was completely quiet. When I got to the sofa, my phone was no longer there. I knew that there was a landline in Grady's mom's office, so that was my only option. I walked as quietly as I could. I pushed open the office door, careful not to make a sound, and saw the house phone sitting on a desk. I ran to it, but someone jumped at me from the side. The intruder had been hiding in the office, waiting for me to enter. I was shoved onto the floor, my head slamming against the side of a desk. I felt a foot press against my neck. The pizza delivery man was standing over me.
"Where is he?"
The man screamed. I tried to answer, but no sound came out. I couldn't breathe. He raised his foot off my neck.
"Let us go,"
I said. "Please." He kicked me in the side.
"Where's Grady? I want my son back."
"Are you Grady's father?" He kicked me again.
"Yes, where is he?"
Grady's mom was divorced. All I knew about her ex-husband was that he was in jail for some violent crime, and she and her son had cut all contact and moved to a new town. I guess he had gotten released and ended up working some minimum wage delivery job in the same town. When he recognized his son's very specific pizza order, he was finally able to track them down. I didn't know much about this man, but I knew that I needed to keep him away from Grady. I lied and told him that Grady was asleep upstairs in his room. He kicked me once more and left. I waited on the floor until I could hear the man walking up the stairs. Then I jumped up and ran to the bathroom where I'd left Grady. The door was open and he wasn't there. I was terrified that his father had already taken him. I looked through the hallway and the living room. Then I found Grady in the kitchen. He had snuck there to get more pizza. I wanted to scream at him for leaving the bathroom, but we didn't have time. I grabbed him and ran out the door. By then, his father had heard us. He was running down the stairs screaming. I slammed the front door, led Grady to my car, and then drove straight to the police station. As we left, the man stood in front of the house and screamed that he wouldn't stop until he found us. Grady's mom met us at the police station. By then, we told the police everything that happened. They'd already sent officers to the house, but the man was gone. Grady didn't seem too scared. He just complained about not being able to finish his pizza. His mom, though, she got a really sad look on her face. "He found us," was all she said. They moved away after that. The police never caught the father. And as for me, that was the very last time I agreed to babysit anyone. I've been a teacher for 30 years. I love my job, and I've had some amazing students, but I always look forward to the long summer vacation. Because I'm a widow, I can travel pretty much wherever I want. This year, I decided to rent a tiny cottage on an island off the coast of Maine. I chose the smallest, most remote island I could find, because I didn't want to deal with a crowd of summer tourists. I wanted peace and quiet. As soon as I settled in, I knew I'd chosen the right place. The island had less than 100 people, all locals. There was a single street in the middle of the island with one shop and one restaurant. That was about it. My first week there was very relaxing. Aside from 2 short trips to the shop, I didn't interact with anyone. I just sat on the beach and read. It was wonderful. Then, one evening, right before sunset, there was a loud knock at my front door. I thought it was the wind, so I didn't answer. But when I looked out the window, I could see the silhouette of a child standing outside my door. He was frozen, waiting for something. I felt a shiver down my back, but I knew I had to answer the door. Maybe this kid was in trouble. So I opened the door and saw who it was. I almost screamed. He was a little boy, about 6, with very dark hairs and pale skin. He looked identical to a student of mine from 30 years ago during my first year of teaching. Martin Jennings was his name. Back then, he was a troubled kid who didn't have any friends because his classmates were scared of him. When our class hamster died, I knew that Martin had done it, though I never found any evidence. By the middle of the year, Martin had become completely unhinged. He gave another student a concussion, so we had to expel him. But he came back to the classroom that night and set fire to the curtains. There was a big hearing about it. I had to testify against him, and he ended up being sent to a mental health facility. After that, I didn't know what happened to him. But this was 30 years ago. The real Martin would have been nearly 40 now. This boy couldn't be the same person, and yet they looked identical. The boy stared at me for a long moment, and then whispered, "Hello, Miss Scott." My heart almost stopped. That was my maiden name. I hadn't used it in decades. "Who are you?" He smiled and said, "I think you know." Then he turned around and walked back toward the beach. I watched him disappear into the darkness. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tried to convince myself that I'd just imagined the boy or even dreamt it. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. He was there, unchanged after all these years. The next morning, I went outside to drink my coffee, and I saw that someone had painted a giant red X on the side of my cottage. I walked straight into town. There were no police on the island. The best I could do was talk to the owner of the market, who acted like the island's de facto mayor. I told him what happened, and he assured me that there were no children on the island. He asked if I'd gotten enough sleep. He didn't believe me. He refused to even look at the graffiti on my wall. With no one else to turn to, I went back to the cottage and prayed that the boy wouldn't come back. I stayed inside all day, making sure that my doors and windows were all locked. That night, the boy returned. I could hear him walking around the house, giggling and throwing pebbles at my windows. "Go away!" I screamed, but that just made him giggle louder. Eventually he stopped. I couldn't hear anything except the wind. Hours passed, and I decided that I'd take a boat back to the mainland in the morning. I couldn't be on this island any longer. By about 3 in the morning, I was finally able to get back to sleep. That didn't last long. I woke up coughing. My room was filled with smoke. Heat was coming from outside my bedroom door, and I realized that my cottage was on fire. Covering my mouth, I stumbled to the window, but it wouldn't open. I was losing strength. I knew that if I stayed in that room just a few minutes more, I'd suffocate. I grabbed a lamp from the end table and shattered the glass. With my last ounce of strength, I crawled through the window. Shards of glass cut into my stomach, but that didn't matter. I'd made it to safety. I could finally breathe. As I was gasping for air, I saw the boy watching me from a distance. But he wasn't alone. He was holding hands with a grown man. The man looked like an adult version of Martin, except half of his face appeared to be disfigured in some way. That's when I knew that the boy wasn't some ghost from my past. The boy was Martin's son. They walked closer. Soon they were standing over me, looking down. The man held a jug of gasoline, ready to douse me with it. I didn't have the strength to stand up and run away. The only thing I could do was talk to him. Using my teacher voice, I shouted, "Martin, you're in big trouble. Go home right now." He didn't move. I knew he was going to burn me alive. But then, he tossed the jug onto the ground and started walking away. The boy followed him. Very soon they were gone.
By then, other islanders had noticed the fire. They gathered around me, missing Martin and his son by less than a minute. That was the last thing I remember before I passed out. I woke up in a hospital on the mainland. The doctor told me I'd be okay. A policeman was there to ask me questions. I gave him Martin's full name and told him everything that happened. He left the room to make some calls. When he came back, he said that my attackers couldn't possibly be Martin and his son. Martin Jennings had set fire to the mental hospital where he'd been committed 30 years ago. The reports said he had died in the fire, along with 3 other patients. The policeman promised me that they'd find out who tried to kill me, but I didn't believe that. I know Martin's still out there, and I pray to God that he doesn't come back for me. A few years back when I was in college, I met a guy I'll name Isaac, who was in the same English class as me. Isaac and I didn't become friends until late into the semester, when we would hang out outside of college. One night after class, we were talking, and I was telling him how I was worried about finding a job when I graduate and paying off my student loan. Isaac was sympathetic, but told me that his loan was already paid off and he could help me out if I was interested. He told me that he had some friends that could line me up with a job that would clear my entire student loan debt. But before he introduced me, I had to agree to it with no questions asked. I knew it was likely to be something illegal, which should have been my first red flag, and that's where the conversation should have ended. However, I said yes, and a few days later went to meet these friends at a location that was given to me only 30 minutes before pickup. I was told to leave my phone so my journey could not be traced. When I arrived, I saw 2 men with balaclavas on. One of the men told me to open the trunk and stay in the car. He walked to the back of my car and put something in the trunk, then closed it. The other man handed me an envelope and told me not to open it until I delivered the drop. On top of the envelope, there was an address with directions. I was nervous, and I was scared of getting caught, but also thought if anything did happen, I could just play ignorant to whatever was in the trunk. I wasn't even sure how much money I was getting paid. I was just told it was enough to pay off all my loans. 2 hours into the journey, I was on a quiet road when I saw a vehicle approaching me in my rearview mirror. As it got closer, high beam headlights flooded my windscreen. I can now see it was a van tailing me, so I put my foot down to try and get away. I was still an hour away from the drop, so I was thinking that whoever this was probably wasn't who I was supposed to be meeting. The van began to flash its lights and signaled to pull over. I pulled over, thinking maybe something was wrong with my car, or maybe this is how the transactions are made. As I stopped, the van pulled in front of me, as if to block me from driving away, and 2 men got out. I stood out of my car and asked them what the issue was, but they didn't respond. Instead, one of the men grabbed me and wrestled me to the ground. I wasn't quite giving up on fighting when the other man came and put a needle in my arm, injecting me with something. I continued to wrestle, but this guy just lay on top of me until I started to feel queasy and lightheaded. I don't know what they injected me with, but I began to lose all strength, and the 2 men picked me up and put me in the van. I could hear them talking, and then it was lights out. I awoke as they were dragging me to a hole which they tossed me in. Then they started shoveling dirt on top of me. Quietly panicking and thinking this was going to be the end of my life, I heard the 2 men start running across the gravel, and then I heard them drive away. As I sat up, I saw 2 headlights approaching. It was dark, and I was still half in a hole, but whoever decided to take that rural road that night will never know how they saved my life. The car didn't stop, but I was able to get to safety. I couldn't call the cops because I didn't know what I was carrying, and it was likely to be highly illegal. I never saw Isaac again, and to this day, I have no idea why these men threw me in their van and drove me somewhere to bury me. Back in the 80s, I was a security officer in a small mall in Indiana. The job itself was good. The pay was incredible, and I usually only worked day shifts. But the place itself was horrible. There was no way around it. It was fucked. It wasn't physically ugly, but it had an awful vibe, to
to the point it scared visitors away. We never had more than a few dozen people at a time, and a lot of stores had been closed for years, and it was all because of this one store. It was one of those New Age mystic shops that were super common in the 80s, and then started fizzling out when people learned that it was all bullshit. It had a corny name, the Witch's Groove or something, and it was run by an older woman in her 60s, who looked like she was still in her early 40s. She had about 17 employees go through her store and quit just in the 3 years I worked there. Not that it bothered her. There was never anyone there, so don't know why she needed employees. Honestly, I don't know how she was even still open, but the whole mall should have already been closed by that point, so I guessed it wasn't that weird. But I think I guessed wrong. I always knew something was wrong with the store and with the mall itself, but I never knew how wrong, not until my first night shift. I was kind of nervous at first. Our mall was never a busy one, but it's so strange being in a place that's supposed to be full of life, and it's empty. After a while, I just started jogging and dancing around, jamming to my Walkman. It wasn't until around 2 a.m., way past closing hours, that I noticed the sounds coming from that dreadful place. It was as if someone kept opening and closing a bunch of doors super hard. I was in a whole other sector, but it was so loud I could hear it. I radioed the guy who was supposed to be there, and he didn't answer, so I ran towards his sector, thinking I'd have to scold some asshole teenagers. But as soon as I turned around the corner, my stomach dropped. The doors from that alley were opening and closing by themselves, hard. The other guy's radio was on the floor, broken, but there was no other trace of him. It took everything I had to not just turn and run. And honestly, I probably would have done just that if my radio didn't start blasting with other officers asking what the hell was going on. There were 2 other security officers in the mall that night, so I radioed them and told them what was happening and to come quickly, and that the guy responsible for this sector was missing. I accused them of trying to prank me and told them it wasn't funny, but none of them laughed or owned up to it. They said they were coming over to check on it with me. I stood there for maybe 2 minutes as the doors slowly stopped opening and closing. By the time they arrived, the doors had stopped and stayed closed, except for the Witch's Groove. Its doors were wide open. Mike and Sully looked at me and then inspected the broken radio. They had some back and forth about calling the cops. Then they asked me what exactly I had seen. When I explained what happened with the doors, they looked at me and sighed, and one of the guards named Sully told me to leave. I just kind of stared at him confused and asked why.
We're gonna call Rebecca and make sure the store's safe before closing it for her. It's haunted. Did no one brief you about the night shift?
At this point, I wish I could say I was brave and skeptical and that I called them on their bullshit. But I didn't. I saw the doors moving, and yeah, it could have been a prank, but I wasn't going to gamble on it. I just looked Sully in the eye, and then Mike, and just went,
Yeah, right, I'm out.
And out I went. They didn't even judge me or anything. I gave them my radio, and I went off towards the elevator so I could get to the locker room on the 3rd floor as fast as possible. On my way there, I wondered if they were pranking me, but they weren't, because as soon as I got to the elevator and pressed the button, lights all over the mall started flickering. The sound of doors opening and closing began again, and this time it was coming from a bunch of different places at once. I started shaking at this point, and once the elevator doors opened, I rushed inside and started pressing the 3rd floor button as hard as I could, but the door wouldn't move. I tried my best to keep my composure, but I could feel fear starting to take over, and it all went to shit when I heard what sounded like a girl say, "Hello," from behind me in what should be an empty elevator. I just dashed. I ran as fast as I could, and as I ran, I heard it cackling behind me. I ran towards the nearest exit by the south side, and I felt like it took forever. I heard footsteps, but I couldn't bring myself to look back, and it was laughing at me for it. When I got close to the exit, I almost shat myself. A young woman was standing there, blocking the exit. I didn't hesitate. I threw myself shoulder first against her, but hit nothing, not even the door. It opened by itself to let me out. When I looked back, I saw that woman, laughing and waving, and suddenly, the lights went out completely, and when they came back, she wasn't there. The door closed on its own slowly, and I didn't even bother trying to open it. I went to my car and got out of there, uniform and all. I went home and just never went back. I called our manager and quit. I drove by the mall the next day, and everything seemed normal. No one had died or disappeared or anything like that. Eventually the mall closed, and it's still abandoned there to this day. People tell stories, and there's a bunch of weird legends surrounding it, but I don't care. You may think I'm a coward, but I'm never setting foot there again.
My wife and I rented a house, and last winter our landlord served us notice to vacate the premises, as he had decided to sell the property. My wife was 8 months pregnant, and not in any physical state to do anything like pack or move house. I convinced my wife to stay with her mother, and said she could apply for houses while I packed and got ready for the move. On the first night my wife stayed with her mother, I stayed up late getting organized. It was about 3 a.m. when I saw a shadow walk past the kitchen window. I should tell you that the kitchen faces into our back garden, which was secure and fenced off, so there was literally no reason for anyone to be in the garden. I turned on the kitchen light, in hopes that it scared off whoever was creeping around. I looked outside from an upstairs window, but couldn't see anyone, but I could see faint footprints around the house and in front of the kitchen window. I decided at this point to leave the downstairs light on and try and get some shut-eye, as I was already up later than I intended to be. I went to sleep and heard nothing for the rest of the night. When I woke up in the morning, I found that the back door had been forced open. There was water on the floor, like someone had walked snow into the house and it had melted. I called the police and checked the house, but whoever had broken in had left. It didn't appear that anything was taken from the house, and there was already stuff packed up that they could have easily walked away with. I called the landlord, who sent someone out to fix the back door. He wasn't happy, and thought it was something I did to try and get back at him for selling the house from under us. I continued to pack throughout the day and into the night. I can't remember the exact time, but I think it would have been around 11 p.m. when I started hearing noises and what sounded like footsteps coming from the loft. The loft had been converted into an additional bedroom and had a staircase leading up there. It was a door I usually kept locked, and so I hadn't checked it when we had the break-in. But lo and behold, the door was unlocked. I grabbed a baseball bat I had gotten out earlier that day and made my way up into the loft. There weren't many places to hide up there, as we just used it as a spare bedroom when family came from out of town. I looked around and saw that the bed that was previously made now looked like it had been slept in. Then something on top of the wardrobe caught my eye. It was a woman. She screamed and leaped off the top of the wardrobe right at me. I fell backward onto the floor, banging my shoulder on the corner post of the bed. She scratched at my face before running off downstairs and out of the front door. I called the police and made a report. They came and checked the room and found some fingerprints and traces of DNA left in the bed. I didn't recognize the woman and don't know why she broke into the house or targeted our house specifically, other than to sleep in the bed. I'm just glad my pregnant wife wasn't home when it happened. When I was a teenager, not yet allowed to work, I made my money the old-fashioned way, babysitting. It wasn't much, but that was how my parents decided I would purchase my own vehicle. I started doing it when I was 14, just around our house. Then, when I turned 15, I was able to branch out more and earn more clients. I still remember one family in particular that I babysat for only once. Once was enough to know that I never wanted to go back, no matter how much they paid me. The family lived only 2 streets over. I only gained them as potential clients when their mom mentioned to mine that they hadn't had a kid-free night since moving into our town. My mom knew that I was never stingy with who I worked for, so she gave them our number, and she called me the next weekend. I wasn't new to babysitting, and they only had 2 children, neither of them requiring diapers. I felt it was going to be a cakewalk. When they offered me $20 an hour, a whole $10 more than I was used to, I didn't think twice. It was their anniversary after all. My mom drove me to their house the following Saturday evening. She gave me the normal spill that every parent gives their daughter before letting them watch a stranger's children, a conversation that this family would soon repeat out of habit. Mostly, I zoned out as I stared at the outside world passing by. Typical teenage attitude. I remember pulling up to the house, realizing it was nothing like I was imagining in my head. I pictured a white picket fence family, but that isn't what answered the door. Instead, I was met with a striking woman wearing what looked like bohemian pants that were too flowy for me. The dirty blonde hair was piled on the top of her head with a blue claw clip. She was bubbly when she invited me inside, and she waved my mother off. The interior of the house was painted in dark greens and had several plants littered throughout. The dad rarely made his presence known, barely coming out from his office. The woman introduced herself as Missy, and her two kids were Lily and Landon. They were 8-year-old twins, and while I never asked, I assumed identical, judging on appearance. Both of them seemed equally unimpressed by my arrival, giving knowing looks between each other when they thought I wasn't paying attention. Missy was still flitting around her house while spouting house rules and assuring me that I could eat whatever they had available, and that they would try to be back at a reasonable hour, that all important numbers were on the counter. The last parting words she spoke were simple reminders that neither twin had any allergies, no medical problems, and that if they got too wired up before bed, their pediatrician okayed the use of melatonin. I nodded and made mental notes of the information flying my way, trying not to usher them out of their own house. Once they left, I closed the door and locked both of the locks right away. Turning around, the twins stood at the base of the stairs, just watching me. Neither one of them spoke to me, opting to retreat into the living room and plop down in front of the television. It was weird, sure, but I thought it was just their annoyance at having a strange girl in their home to boss them around. I let them lead the way, following behind to take a seat on the opposite couch. I rotated my gaze between the two of them and the television. Satisfied that they were fine right where they were, I jumped when a piercing scream came from the screen. They had turned on Halloween, and Michael Myers was in the middle of a hot pursuit with Jamie Lee Curtis. Shooting up, I grabbed the remote from the coffee table and switched it to something more age-appropriate. The last thing I needed were two kids having nightmares the entire night. I'd never be invited back. They gave me the obligatory huff of disapproval as they settled back down. It remained silent except for the talk of the kids on the screen, until a noise came from upstairs. It was a soft thud, almost like something falling onto a carpet. I looked to the ceiling and back, but if the kids heard it, they never let on. 2 seconds later, it sounded like a shuffle of feet above us. I felt my muscles tense as I sat there debating the next move. I decided I would just ask them if they heard anything, but to my shock, they both said no. Nothing else, just no. The evening continued as normal, jumping between snacks and making sure the kids brushed their teeth. Them both being older helped tremendously, knowing that I wasn't having to micromanage. At 9 p.m., both kids had happily dozed off on the couch, watching some cartoon about a purple dog. Things had been relatively normal up until that point, making it possible to assume that whatever I heard earlier was just the house settling. I lost myself again into a book that I had brought along for a situation like this, and curled up into the recliner. I made it 3 chapters until another noise. This time, it sounded louder, like something being thrown into the ground. Slamming the book shut, I popped up onto my feet. The twins were still motionless on the sofa, snoring away. My heart was racing, and I could feel my mouth turning to cotton. I still had the parents' number, but I didn't want to ruin a date night. Bracing myself with a few deep breaths, I made my way to the foot of the steps and peered into the shadowy darkness. I wasn't able to see much before I realized I was going to have to go upstairs. Dread was coursing through my veins as I ascended the steps, graciously realizing that a single nightlight was lighting the hall from a wall plug. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I did a few sweeps across the hall until my eyes landed on a shattered picture frame that was in the center of the hallway. I picked it up and looked for glass that potentially shot across the floor, but nothing. I flipped the frame over and saw a couple standing there. The couple were in their later years, both wearing church clothes. The woman was dressed in a blue knee-length dress, and the man wore suit pants and a button-down top with a bow tie. I couldn't make much else out in the photo due to the lighting, but I placed it on a table that sat at the far end of the hall, just to get it out of the floor. I almost laughed at myself, until I heard it. The noise was ear-splitting from where I was standing, and the vibrations I felt through the floor told me that whatever happened, it was right behind me. For once, I didn't want to turn around, but I had to in order to get back to ground level and check on the kids. Slowly, I pivoted to look back down the hallway, and to my horror, saw steps that had unfolded from the ceiling, landing behind me. That was the clash I heard. I took a few hesitant steps closer, being aware to not step too close to them. It was the steps that led to attics, that much I knew. I also knew that those didn't just fall normally. I circled around them until I was at the base of the last step, staring at the gaping hole it left in the wall. An awful screeching noise flowed through the opening, causing goosebumps to form on my arms. I wanted to leave the house instantly, but I was also curious to see what secrets were hidden away. At the base, I lifted one foot to the step, about to head up. "I wouldn't do that." A boy's voice came from the top of the staircase that led to the first floor. I turned to see both of them standing there, just looking at me. They weren't bothered by the noises. I couldn't find the words I wanted to say, so I just gawked at them. "They don't like it when we go up there." That was the only thing they would offer up. I even tried to explain that I needed to close the door back, but they were adamant that I shouldn't touch it. Even when I tried, they came alive with panic. It took a few tries, but when I saw that their mind was made up, I walked back down with them and tucked them back onto the sofa. I remained in the recliner until a few minutes past midnight when the front door opened. I had never been happier to see a family return home in my life. I stood up to greet them, and when I mentioned the steps, it was the oddest sight. It was like they knew about it. They just exchanged looks until the dad cleared his throat and offered to take me home. I agreed because I was too fearful to even attempt to walk, even if it was only a few streets away. As we made the turn onto my street, I resolved I wouldn't babysit there again anyway, and looked at the father. "What was that?" His hands tightened on the wheel until we parked in the drive, and he looked at me. His eyes were tired, bags now visible on the skin below. "It's nothing. The kids think there's some evil entity in a blue dress that stays up there. One time they even thought it was their grandmother. Now it's just evil. A normal kid's imagination." Breath left my lungs as I remembered the photo that had fallen from the wall. I fumbled the door trying to get out of his car and raced into my own house, locking myself inside. I'm not one to get carried away in all that stuff, but I will say that I never went back there after that. I also don't doubt the kids, but whatever was causing those steps to come crashing down inches behind me, I don't think it was their beloved grandmother. Me and my little sister used to go sledding whenever it would snow. There was a local golf course near our house, and whenever it would snow, all the kids would go there. The golf course was built on a rather big hill, which made it perfect for sledding. The club members would chase us if they saw us, as the sleds would damage the grass, which would affect their game. As kids, this just made it all the more exciting, because they would come out of the club and chase us as we set off down the hill. We would laugh at them as we raced down the hill at top speed. This one night, me and my sister and a couple of our friends decided to sneak out of the house and go to the club while no one else was there. We got to the top of the biggest hill, which we used to call the Elephant's Back, because it would just drop off at the end and there was no turning back. We lined up our sleds. My sister was in with me, and my 2 friends each had their own. We set off first, and my 2 friends followed. As we were just starting to pick up speed, my sister pointed to a man that was running out from the trees at the side of the hill. We rushed past, narrowly missing him, but my friend Jermaine was not so lucky. I didn't see what happened, but it looked like he tackled him somehow, taking him off his sled. We were going too fast to stop, and ended up at the bottom of the hill. His sled came sliding down, but Jermaine was nowhere to be seen. We ran up the side of the hill through the trees, which was easier because the tree roots would allow you to get a footing. As we got halfway up, we found Jermaine sitting against a tree crying, but with no sign of the man. He wouldn't talk about what happened, and when we got home we told our parents, who called the police. The club claimed the man had nothing to do with them, and must have been someone just hiding in the trees. They never did find the guy, and Jermaine never told us what the man actually did to him. Last winter, my brother Tom invited me to his new house in the suburbs. He'd always been kind of a screw-up, so I was really shocked when he called me up and said he bought a house for himself. I knew he didn't have a lot of money, but he said that he'd gotten a really good deal on the place. I was expecting something small and run down, but when I showed up, I couldn't believe my eyes. The place was huge. It was 2 stories, and it even had a swimming pool. I knew I shouldn't have said anything, but I had to ask him why it had been so cheap. Tom just shrugged and said that he had an arrangement, whatever that meant. I decided not to press the issue. He gave me a quick tour, and then we settled into the living room to talk and drink wine. Things were awkward at first. I hadn't seen Tom in 2 years, not since I started dating his ex-girlfriend, Natalie. He'd accused me of stealing her from him, even though they'd already broken up. It caused a huge rift between us. But after a few minutes of chatting, I could feel the old Tom come back. We talked about movies and work, and it seemed like all the bad blood between us was gone. I assumed that being a new homeowner had helped him get over the past. Tom kept encouraging me to drink, and I was starting to feel tipsy. Things were going pretty well, until someone knocked once on the front door, and Tom instantly went pale. He said, "I think it's my neighbor," and then he got up to answer it. There was a tall man standing outside. He walked in without saying anything, as if Tom had been expecting him. He was dressed all in black, with a wide-brimmed hat that hid the top half of his face. He walked past Tom and sat right next to me, still not saying anything. I waited for Tom to introduce him, but he didn't say anything. So I smiled at the man and told him my name. He didn't smile back. I couldn't really see his eyes, but I knew that he was studying me. I turned toward Tom. "You didn't mention that your neighbor was joining us," I said, trying to be as pleasant as possible. I didn't want them to see how creeped out I was. Tom left the room without answering. I was alone in the living room with that man. He wouldn't stop staring at me. I tried to make small talk, but he didn't seem to hear me. This was really weird. He was wearing black gloves. Slowly, he reached out and poked my arm.
You lift weights, right?
He asked. It was the first thing he said to me.
Yeah. And you're a non-smoker, right?
Yes? What was going on? I tried to stand up, but he grabbed my wrist and pulled me back down.
Your brother says that you're quite healthy,
the man said.
Is that true?
I was healthy. I took really good care of myself, but I wasn't going to answer any more of his questions until I found out who he was and what he wanted. "Who are you?" I asked. That was when he smiled. It was the coldest, darkest smile I'd ever seen. He was still holding my wrist, and I could feel his fingers squeeze tighter. "Let go of me!" I shouted. That's when I noticed his other hand reach into his pocket and pull out a cloth. It smelled like chemicals. I'd seen enough movies to know that he was about to chloroform me. He tried to shove the cloth at my face, but I twisted out of his grip and jumped to my feet. The man was much bigger than me, and I knew that he'd definitely be able to take me in a fight. I had to run. I raced toward the front door while he walked toward me. I unlocked the deadbolt and ran outside. I was looking over my shoulder, so I didn't realize that Tom was standing in my way until I collided with him on the porch. Tom grabbed me by the shoulders and held me in place as the tall man walked closer.
What's going on?
I shouted. Tom looked me dead in the eyes and said,
I'm sorry. I didn't have enough money for this place, so I made another arrangement. Please don't fight him. He said it'll be painless.
I knew that the man was right behind me now because I could smell the chloroform. If I didn't do something, he'd knock me out and then, I don't know, kidnap me, harvest my organs. I couldn't believe that my own brother would betray me like this, just for some stupid house. I could see the regret on Tom's face. He hated what he was doing, but he still wasn't letting me go. His face was so close to mine. I couldn't move my arms, so I thought back to all the times Tom and I fought as kids. How could I get out of this? Just as the man reached around and shoved the cloth toward my face, I jerked forward and headbutted Tom right in the nose. He screamed in pain and let go. That gave me enough time to push past him, run to my car, and speed away. Once I got far enough away, I called the police. Less than 10 minutes later, 2 officers met me on the road, and we went back to Tom's new house. The door was wide open, but there were no other signs of a struggle. It's been 3 months since this happened, and I have no idea where Tom is. After that night, he disappeared. I don't know for sure, but I think that the man took him instead of me. He needed his payment. My name is Aiden, and I hate my family so much. I have a twin brother named Cole, and even though we literally have the same DNA, for some reason my parents treat him like the golden child. I was the academic one, who got good grades and won debate championships and stuff. Cole played football and went hunting with Dad and his buddies. No matter what I did, it could never compare to Cole. When Cole's football team got third in the state, Mom called up the local papers and threw a giant party. When I found out I was valedictorian, all I got from my parents was a hearty handshake. We both graduated last year and went to different colleges. Dad ended up paying for Cole's tuition, while I had to use all the scholarships I'd earned to pay for everything myself. It wasn't fair. I wanted to get as far away from Cole and my parents as possible. I decided to stay in the dorms for Christmas, but when spring break rolled around, my dad started getting on my case to come back for the week. He said that everybody missed me, especially Cole, but I didn't believe that for a second. Still, I booked my flight and went back. When I entered the house, Mom and Dad greeted me with big hugs. Mom was even crying. I was instantly suspicious. Why were they acting so excited to see me? I asked where Cole was, and they said that he was up in his room. He was taking a nap, but he'd come down later. I wanted to sit down and catch up with my parents, but Mom asked if I could swing by the grocery store and pick up a few things. I'd just come from the airport, so I really didn't feel like it, but Mom basically begged for me to go until I finally said yes. She handed me a list, and I was about to leave when she stopped me and said I needed to change outfits first. She said I looked sweaty from the trip. I really didn't want to, but she already had a shirt and khakis ready. I did a quick change in the bathroom and then drove Dad's car to the grocery store. I looked around and was surprised that the place was so empty. There weren't any customers in the store, but when I got closer to the back, I saw a single cashier talking to 3 policemen. He was sobbing, and his arm was bloody and bandaged, as if someone had slashed him with a knife. I knew that something bad must have just gone down. Maybe there was a robbery. I started to back away quietly when the cashier guy looked up and noticed me. He pointed and screamed,
There he is! That's the man who attacked me!
The police instantly drew their weapons and ordered me to get on the ground. I was terrified. Why would this guy say that? I dropped to the floor and waited for the cops to come to me. I looked up, just for a second, and noticed that there was something else on the floor. A red pocket knife stained with that cashier's blood. The attacker must have dropped it when he ran off. The knife was kind of far away, but I could still recognize it. That was Cole's knife, the one that Dad gave him for a graduation present. That's when I put all the pieces together. Cole had done something terrible. He'd probably gotten into some stupid argument with the cashier and ended up stabbing the poor guy and fleeing. And my parents, knowing that the police would come after him, forced me into going back there, wearing Cole's clothes. They tricked me into taking the fall for my brother. I told the police where the knife was, because I guess they hadn't seen it, but they just took that as more evidence of my guilt. As the police cuffed me, I tried to explain the situation, but they wouldn't listen. One of the officers even kicked me in the side to shut me up. They shoved me in the back of the police car and drove me to the station. They took my fingerprints and mugshot and everything, and then sent me to some tiny interrogation room. I sat across from a policeman who asked me why I did it. I told him that it wasn't me. It was my twin brother. He didn't believe me at first, until I told him to take the plane ticket out of my wallet. I still had that with me, and it would prove that I was at the airport at the time of the attack. He looked at the ticket, but he still didn't believe me. He asked why my family would set me up, and I explained that my brother was the golden child. I sort of went off, telling him about all the times in my life when my parents had screwed me over in favor of my brother. He nodded gravely. I'll always remember what he said next. He said, "I understand. I have a brother too." By then, the fingerprints on the pocket knife had come back, and it was clear that I was being framed. I gave them my parents' address. 2 officers drove me back there. I waited on the lawn as they led Cole away in handcuffs. He was screaming the whole time. Then they let out both my parents, also in handcuffs. Neither of them said anything. As they walked right by me, I just smiled. I ended up spending the rest of the trip in their empty house. All 3 of them have tried to call me, but I refused to answer. When spring break ended, I flew back to school. That was the last time I ever saw them. After saving up to buy our first house, me and my girlfriend Jennifer finally moved into our own home. We'd been living with my parents, which wasn't always the best living arrangement to have, but we wanted to try and save to put towards a bigger house. Finally, after 3 years of living with my parents, we purchased our own home at an auction, and we moved in around August last year. The first few weeks seemed pretty normal. We decorated, moved our furniture in, and unboxed all of our belongings. After about 3 weeks, I was going to bed one night and saw a man standing in the shadows across the street, watching our house. He saw me up at the window, and so I waved. All the neighbors had been friendly so far, and I just assumed it was someone we hadn't had the chance to meet. As I waved, the man turned and started walking slowly down the street. He was an older gentleman and walked with a walking stick. He was wearing a cap and had long white hair and a beard, and although it was dark, you could tell he was unkempt. I figured he was probably just some nosy neighbor or something and wanted to see what the new residents looked like, and I thought no more of it. A few days passed when I was going to work one morning. I saw the same man standing across the street staring at our house. Again I waved, but he never waved back, and this time he just stood there staring. Jennifer was still in bed as it was her day off, and I didn't really feel comfortable leaving her alone with this guy scoping our house. I saw one of the neighbors coming out of their house. I shouted over to them and walked over, asking if they knew who this man was. "That's Trevor. Trevor used to live in your house until the bank took it off him last year. He'd lived there for over 40 years. His wife died 2 years ago, and they didn't have any kids, so he's just on his own now. I heard he lives in a nursing home not too far away." Trevor looked over towards us talking, and my neighbor waved and called over to him, but Trevor turned around and walked away. As he was now leaving, I got in my car and started my drive to work. I was about 10 minutes into my journey when Jennifer called me, saying she heard a window shatter downstairs. I told her to lock herself in the ensuite bathroom and call the police, and I would come straight home. I arrived home and came through the front door. I could hear shouting coming from upstairs. I ran upstairs to see Trevor in our bedroom, banging on the bathroom door, shouting for Joan to let him in.
I shouted to Jennifer, asking if she was hurt. She said she was safe and still had the police on the phone. Trevor was obviously not well, and although he had broken into our home, I assessed quite quickly that he wasn't much of a threat. I tried to talk to Trevor, but he just continually hit his fist on the bathroom door. 2 police officers eventually arrived, and I shouted at them from upstairs. I explained that I was the homeowner, and my girlfriend was locked in the bathroom. The 2 police officers handled the situation with care and compassion. They came in and spoke to Trevor and said he needed to go with them. Trevor didn't put up a fight, but seemed rather shocked that the police were there. He said his wife Joan was here, and he was looking for her. They led him away, and we told the police officers that we didn't want to press charges, but to please make sure he knows that he can't return. We haven't seen Trevor again since. I can only imagine what it's like to lose the home you spent 40 years of your life living with someone you love, so I don't blame him. I just hope he's somewhere safe and getting the support he needs.
I decided to visit the countryside one day for my vacation, so I got an Airbnb in the rurals of my state. It was really far away from the city where I lived, so I had to drive like 8 hours to get there. I didn't mind. I planned for the road trip and was quite excited for the drive. I set off after work and finally got to my Airbnb. It was surrounded by trees and in the middle of nowhere. By the time I arrived, it was beyond dark, but the Airbnb had lights on the front porch, so it was easy to find. Nothing seemed wrong with the place. It was clean and tidy and spacious even. There were no nearby neighbors, and the next town was an hour over, which is just what I wanted. I entered the code to get in through the front door, and got in. I was so tired that I immediately fell onto the couch in the living room and fell asleep. I woke up when I heard someone trying to open the door of the house. I heard what seemed to be the sounds of keys rattling and clicking, as if someone was trying to unlock the door. The front door had a window, and as I looked, I saw a male figure wearing what seemed like a black ski mask. I don't think he noticed me as he was looking down while he tried to pick the lock and jig the handle. I was scared witless. I knew he was trying to force himself in, but why now? Why tonight? I didn't want to move, as I wasn't sure if he saw me or not, but if I moved, he would definitely know someone was inside. This could scare him off, or even cause him to kick the door in. Then it occurred to me, my car was in the drive, so he knew someone must have been here. I couldn't call 911, as I didn't want him to hear me. I tried to cover my phone and text the host, making sure the intruder couldn't see the light from my phone. It was late at night, so I didn't know if my host was even awake. However, just as I sent that text, the intruder was no longer at the front door. I had no idea where he went. He just vanished. He might be looking around trying to find another way in. I hadn't even looked around, so wasn't even sure if there were any windows open or unlocked. I took this as an opportunity to crawl off the couch, hoping that he isn't watching me from somewhere else. I was looking at all my surroundings as I moved along the floor as slowly and as quietly as possible. But the thing is, I didn't even know the layout. So I was probably even more blind than him at this point, especially since the lights weren't on in the inside of the house. I looked around for a place to hide. I noticed what looked like a closet door. I opened it and hid inside the closet. It was cramped, but it felt like the safest place I could be at that moment. I wasn't ready to confront the intruder. Who knows what weapon he could have, especially if he was prepared to break into the home. Once inside the closet, I looked at my phone and decided to text everyone I knew. I called my brother, which, to my surprise, answered the call. I immediately hung up. I called him just so I could get his attention, and then sent a text explaining my situation and to call 911 in my area. He responded with a reply saying he called 911 for me. I wasn't sure how long they were going to take, but I knew it wasn't going to be minutes. I had no idea where the intruder was or what he was doing. At this point, I was praying and hoping he wouldn't break in, and, if he did, that he wouldn't check the closet I was hiding in. There was so much silence. If it wasn't for the clock on my phone, I wouldn't know how long I was sitting there waiting. But it was that suspenseful silence that made me dread as I was waiting. Was he still here? Was he going to break in at any moment? I thought it would have been much better if he just decided to break in right away, so I could prepare myself for that moment, rather than being teased as if he was some sort of boogeyman. Around an hour or so, something finally broke the silence. It was cars coming up. Cars with police sirens. I finally felt relief. The cops knocked on the front door, and I scrambled out of the closet to greet them at the front door. They questioned me, and I gave them the full story, but I didn't really know much. I didn't see a face or a vehicle, or anything that would give any clue to who it was or why he was there. The police confirmed that the lock on the front door had been tampered with, as it was slightly broken and still had a pin sticking out of the lock. There wasn't a lot they could do with no tire tracks, fingerprints, or a description of the man. They told me it probably wouldn't go any further. The police advised me to find alternative accommodations for the night, as the man is still out there and could return. I called the host, who spoke to the police, and without any question offered me a full refund. It wasn't his fault. He seemed like a nice guy, but I would never, ever stay in a remote Airbnb, or even any remote area after this again. It took the cops an hour to arrive, and it scares me to think what might have happened if he did get in, or if I never woke up. The story I'm about to share with you happened just over 4 years ago, when I'd recently started a new career as a patient transporter. It was easy enough for the most part. I had to wheel people and equipment around the hospital from one place to another. I get to meet some really nice people, and most of them tell me stories about their lives, their jobs, or their children and grandchildren. Some even tell me that they have a daughter or granddaughter they could put me in contact with to go on a date. I generally just humor them and laugh it off, but it's kinda sweet, really. I met this one man not long after starting my new job. He was called Mr. Reynolds and was very sick, and unless some miracle was in the near future, I think he'd pretty much been told his days were numbered. I would take him back and forth to various wards and departments within the hospital for scans and x-rays, etc., and I got to know him relatively well. He would tell me stories about his family and his late wife and how they bought their first house together. This one night, I was working the night shift, and I got held up at home, so was late coming into work. As I was starting my shift, I was walking down the hall outside the ward where Mr. Reynolds was being cared for. He was just standing there facing the wall. His face had a lifeless expression, and he looked almost confused and disoriented. It was like he had forgotten who he was or where he was. It wasn't uncommon to see this in patients, but Mr. Reynolds didn't have any illness that affected him mentally. He was still fully compos mentis and knew who he was and where he was, so this definitely seemed out of character for him. I stopped to talk to him, and he told me he needed to go to the bathroom and asked if I would take him. I agreed to take him, but said I would need to get a nurse to come and check on him, as we weren't allowed to give care to patients in this way. It wasn't within our job description, but we also weren't trained at the time in caring for people in such a way. We just transported them around the hospital. I escorted Mr. Reynolds to the closest bathroom, and as I locked the door, Mr. Reynolds thanked me for being a kind human and always treating him with respect. I always try to be kind and respectful, but it's never something I expect to be thanked for. It's just who I am. I thanked Mr. Reynolds, but disregarded the comment, as he didn't seem himself, and thought maybe he was given some extra strong pain meds or something. I went to see the nurse at the ward reception, where Mr. Reynolds was being cared for. He shouldn't have really been able to get out without being stopped at the entrance to the ward. I explained to the nurse that Mr. Reynolds was wandering the hall outside the ward, and I'd taken him to the toilet. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Reynolds died this afternoon." I stood there, looking at her, thinking it was some kind of sick joke. "How can he be dead? I just saw him and walked him to the bathroom." "I'm not sure who you just spoke to, but it wasn't Mr. Reynolds." The nurse and I walked to the bathroom where I'd left Mr. Reynolds, or whoever it was, and the door was locked. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I knocked again before deciding to use my override key for the door. When I opened it, the room was empty. There was no one there. I still wasn't convinced, and the nurse showed me the paperwork to prove he had died earlier that afternoon. I was so confused. I felt sick and cold, and ended up finishing my shift early and going home. This was my first time getting close to someone in my job and them dying. I still work at the hospital, and I've never had any experience like this since, but I'm convinced that I saw Mr. Reynolds' spirit that day, and he was letting me know in his own way that he was okay. I've always been a pretty active person. For reference, I'm a 22-year-old petite Hispanic woman who grew up in a family full of boys. So, while I loved playing with my Barbies when I was a kid, I also enjoyed playing manhunt and football with my cousins during the summer, and then going camping during the fall. Now, as an adult, I'm still as active and exercise every day as a way to de-stress after work. My favorite way to get my steps in is to go hiking on my local trail. The scenery is beautiful, just miles and miles of wildlife, so it was the perfect place for me to tune out the world and jog my stress out. I run at the same time every week since I have a set schedule and get anxious when things don't go according to plan. One night during early winter, around 6 in the evening, I was doing my evening run, enjoying the sounds from the bugs and wildlife around me, when I heard a sound that instantly made me stop in my tracks. It was a baby, or rather a baby crying, somewhere deep in the woods. What I did next, I know was stupid, but at the time, I wasn't thinking about anything but the fact that during the winters where I live, it can reach temps of negatives during the night. I kept thinking of the baby, probably lost in the woods, and no one was looking for them. So I did what I thought was right at the time. I went toward the sound of the crying baby. Within a minute of walking toward the crying, I noticed that the sound was coming from deeper in the forest than I expected. I quickly crossed the marked trail, uneasy as I went off track, but confident since I knew the forest well, as I kept jogging quickly toward the lost child. When I was only a few yards from where the child was supposed to be, the crying abruptly stopped for a brief moment, but it was enough for me to hear it. A click. I froze in place and listened carefully as I heard another click right before the crying started over again. And then I realized that the closer I was to the sound, the more off it sounded, almost robotic. I took a couple of cautious steps toward the crying again, and that's when I saw the cause of the crying. I picked it up, and my hands shook. In the middle of the forest, dirty and obviously fake, was a toy baby doll that was still crying uncontrollably. A branch snapped from the side of me, and I saw someone hide behind a tree. Before my mind could catch up with my body, I was sprinting in the direction I came, and quickly I heard heavy footsteps come from behind my retreating form. I was freaking out, but since I was a long-distance runner and kept track of landmarks as I went off track, I was able to get back onto the marked path within minutes. The steps stopped behind me at some point, but I didn't stop running until I was back to the beginning of my trail and back at my car. I got in, almost in tears because I couldn't find my keys at first, and tore out of there like my butt was on fire. I heard the cries of a baby again, and realized that in my rush to get away, I had taken the toy baby with me. I remember opening the window and chucking that toy out of the window. As soon as I calmed down enough, and there were enough miles between me and that forest, I called the police and told them what happened to me. That's when they informed me that they had a report that sounded exactly like mine from the week before. Only the woman who heard it didn't try to follow the crying and instantly reported it to the police. But by the time they checked, whoever was trying to lure the woman away was long gone. And since I threw the toy doll in the middle of some random road, they couldn't dust it for prints to see if the guy was in the police database. I don't regret throwing that doll on the road, but I do regret that I didn't give it to the police, because that guy is still out there, trying to lure women deep into the woods to do God knows what to them with the sounds of a distressed baby crying. I haven't been to that forest since, and I don't hike alone anymore. Janet lived across the street from where we lived. I was 16 at the time and would babysit for her regularly. She only moved in about 6 months ago, but made friends with my mom right away and asked if I would like to babysit every now and again.
She was a single mom and had 2 girls, aged 3 and 5, who we'll call Becky and Lisa. They were the sweetest 2 girls and would giggle at everything and anything. When I would babysit, I would generally put the girls to bed at about 7 p.m., and then the rest of the night was my own. Free to watch movies and text boys, that sort of thing. Both the girls slept in the same room, and there was a camera set up so I could watch them on a baby monitor. There were other cameras set up as well that covered the rest of the house, inside and out. These were all linked to Janet's phone, and she had been very honest and upfront about them, and said these weren't to spy on me, but for all our safety. I didn't mind, and knew she would probably check on them every now and again, just to make sure everything was okay, without having to disturb me. Janet was cool, and would let me watch things I shouldn't without telling my parents. She would also make sure there was plenty of root beer and yummy convenience foods for me to indulge in once they were asleep. On this one particular night I was babysitting, Janet was working late and wouldn't be home until after midnight. I followed my usual routine and eventually fell asleep on the couch and was awoken to the house phone ringing. It was Janet. She was frantic and crying, saying she could see the silhouette of a man standing in the corner of the girl's bedroom. Without thought, I ran upstairs and ran straight into the bedroom, switched on the light, to find no one there. Janet was still on the phone. I told her there was no one there and even checked the closets and other rooms just to make sure. Janet appeared confused and said that no one left the bedroom as she was watching on the hall cameras and was convinced she saw someone in there. She settled down and said she would see if she could finish early and would be home as soon as she could. I told her not to rush and that everything was okay. I went back downstairs and helped myself to some pizza and rewound my movie to where I fell asleep. I continued to check the baby monitor frequently, and there was no movement of any kind. After about an hour or so, I heard crying from upstairs. I casually got up off the couch and walked up to the bedroom, thinking nothing of it, and flicked the light switch. Nothing but darkness. I got goosebumps as I entered the room, but didn't want to overthink it, as it was probably nothing. I went over to Becky, who was crying, and picked her up to comfort her. As I looked up, I noticed the closet door to be open slightly. I was certain I closed it earlier. I continued to look around the room while my eyes were still adjusting to the darkness, and then I saw the figure of a man standing in the corner of the room. He was dressed all in black with a hood up, so I could barely see his face, but I could see his eyes, and he was looking right at me. I froze. I didn't know what to do. We just stood there staring at each other for what seemed like an eternity. The man slowly started walking around the room, keeping eye contact with me. As he got closer to the door, he made a run for it downstairs and out the front door. I ran downstairs and locked the door and called my dad to come over. My dad stayed with me until Janet arrived home. Janet checked the footage with me, and my dad's still there. The man came out of the closet. I wasn't sure how this could happen, as I know I checked, and it was definitely empty. We all went upstairs to have a closer look, and found a trap door in the floor of the closet. Janet said she had never noticed it before, and I definitely didn't notice it. She had lived there for 6 months at this point, and was completely unaware of this door in the closet, and in her child's room no less. It was designed to be hidden, like a low-key panic room of some kind, so it kinda made sense that it had gone unnoticed. My dad climbed into the small space and said it was trashed, like someone had been living there. We don't know how he got in, or if it was possible to re-enter from the outside. Janet stayed with us that night with her kids, and the next day someone came to secure it. It was reported to the police, but we never found out who the man was.
This story happened around 12 years ago, when I was only 16. Around that age, you could say that I had 0 parental supervision. My mother just wasn't interested, and my dad knew my mom made the rules. That was just how it was with my family. Well, it led to me getting involved with the wrong group of friends. At 16, I was hanging out with people well into their 20s. Now that I'm older, I'm aware how dumb and creepy it actually is. Anyway, I was the type that I always wanted to fit in. I didn't like to show weakness against these older groups of peers. Well, one night the oldest girl in the group suggested we go camping at this spot she had found a few weeks earlier on a hike. Everyone was immediately on board, and I managed to tell my mom that I wasn't coming home that night, and that I was going to a friend's house. Once that was handled, We went and pulled all the camping gear out of the basement. There were 4 of us, and we all rode together. What the girl failed to mention was that the place she had in mind was nearly 3 hours away, and it was already 6 p.m. Granted, everyone seemed to be annoyed at the omission, but being the youngest, I just shut up and dug my nose into a book that I brought along. After what felt like ages, we arrived at this desolate side road that had Spanish moss hanging from the weeping willows. It looked like something straight out of a movie. Pulling the car over, we grabbed the gear and followed her into the woods. The woods were overgrown and there seemed to be no actual trail. There were no houses nearby, and we hadn't seen a car for miles, which just added to the loneliness. The girl stopped, and we almost all fell over her. In front of us stood a clearing that had trees circling it. The grass was shorter there, and it looked like a better option than the nonsense we just walked through. Mind you, it was also nearly 9:45 p.m. Using a small Coleman lantern that we brought with us, we started setting up this giant 6-person tent we had decided to bring. Once that was up, we all pulled our sleeping bags inside and set up camping chairs all around the tent. One of the guys started a small fire, and by 10:15, we were good to go. The girl had brought alcohol along with her in a giant duffel bag that she kept clutched to her chest and abdomen. As we all sat around, the guy she was with suggested scary stories, which everyone jumped on board with. They claimed it was a rite of passage. Not much got under my skin, so I was fine with it, until the girl pulled a Ouija board out of her bag, along with a pendulum and multiple black candles with tiny little black holders. Had it been any other situation, they'd be adorable. As soon as I realized what was happening, I felt my entire body go cold. I wasn't a big believer, but I didn't want to know for sure. Everyone else had used the alcohol as liquid courage and was excited to see what would happen. I refused to put my fingers on the planchet. It was a nagging voice in my head saying, "Don't do it," and I didn't. Sure, they made fun of me for a while, but they wouldn't be laughing for very long. I sat stoically in one of the chairs and just watched from a distance as they set it up and all placed their fingers on it. The girl was the one who started speaking first and asked the usual question of, "Is anyone there?" And they all seemed to hold their breath for a response. 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and 4 minutes ticked by with no luck. She did it again. It was slight at first, but from what they said, the planchet twitched. All of them looked at each other, and I was even now staring at them. They all assumed one of the other members did it. As they were in the middle of their screaming match, the planchet started to move again. I couldn't make out everything, but it spelled H-A-H-A at the end. Confused, the others started to fire more questions at the board, but the movement was indicative of someone wanting to keep a conversation going. The answers were short and sweet. The girl who conjured this brilliant idea got it in her head that this wasn't real, and it was them playing a joke when she decided to verbally berate the board. Most of us just stared with our jaws on the ground. I tried to warn her that it's probably not the best idea to talk smack to potential spirits because of the multitude of ways it could go wrong, but she ignored me. She called the board stupid and weak and said whoever was talking was minuscule considering they could barely formulate a longer phrase. Throughout all of it, the board never spoke back, but within the next couple of minutes, it did something far, far worse. The girl continued to trash talk, and most of us had checked out mentally by then, but it got our attention when she froze mid-sentence and her expression changed. It went from having a good time and a bit tipsy to looking like she had seen the devil himself. Her eyes were the size of $50, and her bottom lip trembled. She looked like she was going to start crying. The guy she was with leaned over to try to see what was wrong, but she stared straight through him into the nothingness that was lurking in the forest. While his face was nearly right in front of hers, she let out a blood-curdling scream that sounded straight out of a Michael Myers flick. She proceeds to fling her head side to side in a panic, repeatedly saying that they were coming. They were watching. Trying to figure out what was wrong with this girl, everyone else seemed to get hit with the smell of sulfur. 2 of the others started gagging from it. Here it was. 3 of the 4 people out here were all losing their sanity. I stood up trying to figure out what was going on with all of them, considering I was the only one who seemed unscathed. Said boyfriend managed to squeak out that they needed to say goodbye on the board before anything else happened, and as soon as they touched the planchet, it set out rapidly spelling out R-U-N, R-U-N repeatedly. On the third completion, the girl who was seeing things sprang to her feet and whispered that someone was there before completely turning into a track star. Instead of going towards the car, she ran further in the opposite direction. Her boyfriend took off, but the rest of us were still trying to figure out what to do. I was opting to stay there and wait, but from a distance, another scream sounded in the trees. Assuming someone was in danger, all of us set off. The only thing I had to defend myself with was pepper spray, but I wasn't going empty-handed. We ran through the dense branches, and as we came out onto what appeared on the other side, I saw the couple on the ground. He was holding onto her as she clutched her ankle. He pointed to a root that was in the ground but sticking up. We waited on her boyfriend to convince this hysterical woman to let him carry her back. To pass the time, I started just walking around aimlessly. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, but when I took a step while staring at the shape of a building in the overgrowth, I too almost twisted an ankle when the earth suddenly dropped away. Stumbling back, I managed to catch myself. Using the small light we brought, I shined it in a semicircle around me, and that's when I realized the mistake that everyone else made that night. The dip in the earth? That was a grave depression. Several broken and decimated headstones were in mismatched heaps all around. I tried to tell myself that they were animals, but one look at the worn writing bore the inscription of a soldier dating back to the Civil War. Suddenly, I didn't want to be there anymore, and neither did anyone else. The only exception was I didn't feel threatened like the others. I was uncomfortable, but mainly at the thought of someone berating a dead person, not because I felt threatened. Everyone else felt like they were going to end up missing. It was so bad that when I suggested we leave and walk towards the way we came, everyone refused. They opted to walk straight and reckoned if there's a graveyard, then a road has to be somewhere close by. Thankfully, it was. Trekking our way out, as we grew nearer to the edge of the cemetery, we saw what appeared to be wooden steps that Mother Nature had started to reclaim. We practically sprinted down the steps and onto the road. It wasn't until I was at the bottom step that I saw a plaque covered with vines. It was a historical landmark plaque that claimed that the site was a cemetery from the 1800s. There was a city that used to be there, but when the Civil War happened, they torched the city and it never recovered. The only thing that's left of the city is that piece of land. Timidly, we walked the half-mile back down the road to where our car was. It's been years, and I don't know what happened to that girl. She stopped coming to parties and stopped really going anywhere. She never told any of us what happened to her that night. The only explanation that I can think of is I didn't touch the planchet, so its problem wasn't with me. Then again, I might never know.
When I was a kid, roughly 9 years old, my best friend, Lena, moved away for her dad's job. It was only about 20 miles away, but as a kid, that seemed forever away. After they settled in, I was asked to go to their house for a sleepover. I was so excited. I had spoken with my friend on the phone, and she told me that she thought the house was haunted. I didn't really believe her, as I thought ghosts were just something made up to scare kids. My mom drove me over with an overnight bag and dropped me off. The house was really nice, bigger than the one they used to live in. It was great seeing my friend again. When it was time to go to bed, her mom came in and tucked us both in. We stayed up talking and giggling, trying not to be heard by her parents. Eventually, we heard her parents going to bed. They looked in on us and we pretended to be asleep. Once we knew they were gone, we started talking again. We had a torch that we shared and told scary stories that we were making up on the spot. My friend told me that they had a ghost that came into the kitchen and ate their food and biscuits. I laughed, obviously, while my friend swore to me that she was telling the truth. We stayed up a bit longer talking, and I heard a noise coming from the kitchen. Lena looked at me. "What is it?" I told her I thought I heard something from the other room. "See, I told you. Follow me and I'll show you." I crept downstairs with Lena leading the way, and lo and behold, there stood a woman in the kitchen, eating food right out of the packet. "See, now do you believe me?" I was frozen. I was the same age as Lena, but I knew that this wasn't a ghost. This was a real person. The woman looked round at us. She must have heard our voices or something. She screamed and threw a packet of food at us as we turned to run away screaming. Lena's parents both came running out asking what was going on. Lena told them there was a ghost in the kitchen, while I argued it was a woman. Her parents didn't believe the ghost version of the story either, and her mom took us to her room while her dad looked around and checked the house. The front door was still locked, but he noticed the basement door was open. He called the police, who came and did a full sweep of the house, but found nothing. We don't know where that woman disappeared to, but Lena said she continued to hear noises throughout the night for years to come, but never saw her again.
I grew up in San Francisco, so I don't have a lot of experience in small towns. I don't feel safe in places that aren't filled with lights and people. My boyfriend Hudson is from rural Idaho, and last spring, he convinced me to go to his hometown and meet his parents. I was nervous about meeting them, but I was more nervous about driving through all those country roads. I knew that parts of Idaho were probably beautiful, but I didn't like the idea of wide open spaces and no cell phone reception. Eventually, we agreed on a week-long road trip up to Idaho and then back down. The first day was pretty normal. Hudson drove and I was the navigator. We stopped at a cheap hotel and got back on the road early the next morning. That's when the trouble started. I'm not even sure what state we were in at the time. Probably Oregon. We were driving on a one-lane highway through a thick forest when one of our tires popped. We pulled over to the side of the road, which ran along a deep ravine. I have a real fear of heights, so I tried not to look over the edge. Hudson got out to grab the spare while I waited inside the car. He was gone for a long time. Then he peered back through the window with an embarrassed look. "I lost the tire," he said. I got out of the car and followed Hudson to the edge of the cliff. He pointed toward a small black shape on the ground below. I guess he'd accidentally dropped the spare tire, and it had rolled over the edge and into the ravine. At first, I thought it was funny, but when I tried to call AAA, I realized that we didn't have any reception. It had been an hour since we'd seen another car. We were stranded here. Hudson could tell I was panicked, so he wrapped me in a big hug and told me we'd be okay. He planned to climb down into the ravine and get the spare tire. I argued with him, of course. His plan was stupid and dangerous. That didn't stop him. He kissed me and then started climbing down the ravine. I was too scared to watch. He was gone for about 5 minutes when I heard him scream from the bottom of the ravine. I couldn't see him through the tree branches. I called down to him, but he didn't respond. It was the middle of the day, but storm clouds had rolled in, making everything really dark. It started to rain. I kept calling Hudson's name, but he never answered. I knew that I needed to climb down and find him, but I was too scared. I convinced myself that it would be better if I got back in the car with all the doors locked and waited for someone to drive by. For an hour, no one came. The rain got worse. Then, a man climbed out of the ravine. It wasn't Hudson. This man was much older, dressed in a yellow raincoat. He looked up at me and waved. I reached for the pepper spray in my pocket, but I realized that it wasn't there. Hudson had it, along with our only set of keys. I looked around the car, but I didn't see anything I could use to defend myself. The man looked into my window and tapped on the glass. I couldn't see his eyes under the yellow hood. "Ma'am," he said, "I need you to come with me. Your friend is hurt." I didn't unlock the doors. I asked him who he was and what happened to my boyfriend. He didn't give me any answers. He just kept begging for me to come with him. He said that we didn't have any time. I didn't trust that man, but I was so worried about Hudson that I probably would have gone with him if I wasn't so scared of climbing down the ravine. I told him that I couldn't. I even lied and said that Hudson told me to stay in the car no matter what happened. He asked me one more time to go with him, and when I shook my head, the man went absolutely insane. He pounded on the window and screamed. He pushed against the car so hard that I was worried it would topple into the ravine too. I closed my eyes and covered my ears.
I don't know how long he shook the car and screamed, but eventually he gave up. When I opened my eyes again, he was gone. Just then, an old pickup drove down the highway and parked next to the car. Hudson got out of the passenger's side and limped toward me. I got out of the car and hugged him. Hudson said that he twisted his ankle when he reached the bottom, but thankfully a local farmer had found him and brought him back here. I asked Hudson if he'd seen a man in a yellow raincoat. Hudson had no idea what I was talking about, but the truck driver heard me and accidentally dropped the tire onto the ground.
You didn't talk to him, did you?
Yeah, he told me to come with him, but I wouldn't leave the car.
You shouldn't have said anything. Now he knows you.
I tried to ask the truck driver for more information. Who was this guy and what did he want? But the truck driver refused to say anything. He changed our tire and told us to get out of there as fast as we could. I really wanted to get some answers from him, but Hudson slipped him a 20 and we drove off. For the rest of our trip, I couldn't stop thinking of the man in the yellow coat. I know he was real, but I don't know what he wanted. Hudson keeps telling me that he was probably a guy who was just trying to help, but I don't believe that. I've thought about that man every day since, praying that I'll never see him again.
I want to preface my story by admitting I've always been a hopeless romantic. So when I was 20, I did what any girl obsessed with finding love does. I downloaded every dating app you could think of. I swiped left, guy after guy, until I swiped right on him. For the sake of privacy, I'll call him C. C and I started talking the same day we matched. It surprised me at first at how much we seemed to have in common. Whenever I mentioned a band I loved, he would tell me he loved them too. My favorite movie? It was his favorite too. I should have realized he was only parroting everything I said back, never saying anything until after I had brought it up. Red flag number 1. A few days talking on the app, we moved to exchanging numbers, talking on the phone all night long. I'm embarrassed to admit how easily I fell for C and the words he said to me, but I thought that I had finally found my person. Everything was going great, until C kept refusing to meet. At first, he stated he was too busy to meet up, but after weeks passed and we still hadn't met, he admitted he was scared to meet me because he was worried about what I would think of his looks, even though his profile pics were handsome. Red flag number 2. Fast forward 2 months, and C surprised me one random day by asking me to meet for coffee. I was so ecstatic that I got to the cafe half an hour before the date, but he never showed. Understandably, I was devastated. I remember leaving the cafe in tears, but stopped when I saw something waiting for me on my car. A single white rose with a handwritten note that read, "You looked beautiful." Instead of being flattered, I was boiling with rage. Not only had C stood me up, but he had watched me stand in that cafe alone, waiting for him like an idiot. Still, I wanted to make excuses for him and asked for an explanation, but he didn't have one and kept trying to act like it wasn't a big deal. So I broke up with him, and, surprising and hurting me, he seemed to take the breakup okay, as long as we could remain friends. And that was red flag number 3. A week after our breakup, I was getting ready to leave for work one night when my coworker came to find me to tell me that some man asked for me by name and description. I asked her who it was, and she described a man 20 years my senior, but I didn't know who she was describing. I chalked it up to a customer remembering me when I rang him up, since we all had to wear name tags. But then she gave me something he left for me. A single white rose, with a small note attached that read, "I miss you." I was terrified. Not only had C catfished me, but he also knew exactly where I worked. I had only casually told C what franchise I worked for, but there were 20 stores of the same name in a 10-mile radius of me. I was scared, but again I was naive and thought that C would take my continued silence as my answer. He didn't. White roses started appearing everywhere I went. My car, job, and even outside my apartment door. Each came with notes that got more and more frantic. My sister finally convinced me to involve the police after I called her in tears one night when C had left another flower, but outside my bedroom window. At first, the police didn't know how he knew all the places I would be. They even checked my car for a tracker and found nothing. But then, they asked me a simple question that sent a chill down my spine. Was I still matched with C on the dating app we met? The same app that tells you how many miles you are from a person. The police told me they had seen a similar case before, where a man narrowed down the store a girl worked at by using the location feature and his knowledge of her store name. It took a few tries, but when he found her, the man followed her home and from work, then would follow her any time she left the house, until he knew all the locations of the places she frequented and her schedule. To say I was terrified was an understatement, and since I had no hard evidence that this was the case with C, no camera footage in front of my house, no name on the letters he left me, and only the word of my coworker who he had talked to once, there wasn't much they could do. Until a stalker escalates, the police usually can't do anything, and by then, it's usually too late. I had no choice but to pack up all my belongings and move across states to stay with my sister. I did so in the middle of the night, after making sure there were no cars waiting for me to leave my house, and I never looked back. I deleted all my dating accounts, bought a camera for my sister's door, and I don't date anymore. Even though all this happened years ago, I'm still scared to open my door in the morning, in fear I will see a single white rose. Or worse, to see C waiting for me. The scariest part? I never saw him, so for all I know, the kind older man ringing me up at my local store could very well be C, and I would never know.